Cadell Last, how are you, sir?
Yo, yo, OG.
Are we doing all right? I really enjoyed the Isabella presentation. So I have a question. When she talked about polypolitics, and I'll ask Javier as
Patty.
well. Say it one more time, sir.
Patty.
Patty politics. Mr. Rivera, good to see you, sir. So, gentlemen, when we talk about patty politics, is that a way to think about it, the movement? I feel like today in politics, there's a lot of debate about what is right. You know, what's the right thing to do? What's the human right? What's the moral right? It almost is like a way to think about the movement, the patty politics, is instead we have to ask, what do we want? Like, what do we want? And that's, of course, a million times more difficult because you have to own it. Like right now, you could say, oh, I'm only defending this because it's a human right. Oh, I'm only defending this because it's the right thing to do. But if you start having to say, what do we want? What do we want human beings to become in different things? And how do we want to use technology? Then we have to own our wants. And that's scary because we have to come to terms with ourselves. What are your thoughts on it? I'm curious because I think what she's getting at is critical for the question of the real and politics moving forward, et cetera, so forth.
Well, I definitely think the emphasis on human rights is tied to a type of universal liberalism and humanism, which is increasingly untenable or just I don't know, like almost like a utopian ideal of a very naive kind, which we're confronting in the 21st century as a, like she's emphasizing in her article, The Patty Political Century. She talks about how Badiou's thinking about how did we come to subjectivize the 20th century. And I think that when we think about how we're going to come to subjectivize the 21st century, I think emphases on human rights and this way of thinking is precisely being confronted by the alienness internal to the human project and the alienness internal to the human civilization. And of course, with Isabel's work, she's I'll think it's quite overlap with my PhD thesis as well, with the emphasis on artificial intelligence and massive technological complexification, which is dramatically challenging our basic norms of what we take to be form, like the form of human rights, for example. I don't know if that answers your question, but those are the thoughts that come to
No,
mind.
I think it's a very good reply, and I'm going to force Javier Rivera. Man, he was talking about Badiou. He was talking about your boy. You all over that. So, you know, and Michelle, good to see you. So I'm very, because it's like, for example, it's like when we can talk about human rights, like what is the enjoyment that's behind human rights? It's good to see you, Hunter. We're talking about Isabel Millar's presentation just a moment ago, where she was talking about patty politics, a new kind of politics that's going to be taking psychoanalysis seriously. So she also goes into Baudrillard and different things. And there's this idea of the movement of politics, and then I'll give it to Javier Rivera, from, say, asking questions of what's the right thing to do, like what are human rights, and instead in polypolitics, where you have patty politics, I'm going to say poly a million times. Please, Cadell.
I just want to say very quickly, there's a really good presentation. I think Zizek was involved in it, where they asked the question, and Jacques Milner is also involved in it, where they asked the question, is sexuality compatible with human rights? And I think that that's a patty political question, because I think Isabel Millar is pointing to this relationship between life, death, and the undead related to the sexual drive. And I think that's what they're trying to get at with is sexuality compatible with human rights?
Oh, that's lovely. And Mr. Thomas Wynn, it's a pleasure to see you, sir. I hope you're doing well. We're talking about patty politics from Isabella Millar, but we can talk about whatever. And it's very interesting on this idea of sexuality compatible with human rights. And what does it mean to move from a politics defending human rights or looking for human rights or stuff like that to what do we as human beings want? Because often we don't want to own what we want. We want to talk about what we want, but not actually want anything. And that might have something to do as well as what would it mean to have a politics that takes seriously the clearing, take seriously making space for something to divulge itself, as opposed to what do we want. Maybe what we want is maybe something to have a state. Yes, I want pizza as well, actually. That would be quite lovely. Maybe a little upgraded from the Red Baron to maybe Mellow Mushroom here in the States. We will see. Maybe what we should want is to actually make a clearing and engage in a Boobian waiting to see what can come forth. But let me give it to Javier Rivera. Mr. Rivera, how are you today, sir?
Pretty good, pretty good. Man, there's so much to this. But there's a couple of things that I've been thinking about. And Miller pointed out a lot of them. like this. Um, So because I've been reading Iris Murdoch lately, and she's kind of like a Platonic thinker, something that she said in The Sovereign of the Good that really has been kind of haunting me is that she talks about how the object of attention sort of determines the choice already. It sort of
Mm,
already determines the choice. So the thing that is haunting me about this is that when Miller's talking about Patipolitics, is that she seems to be alluding to like what we're paying attention to.
mm,
And it seems obscure exactly what that is. Um, because it seems like we have a sense of all the actions that are happening and the choices being made. But if I'm taking Murdoch seriously here, she seems to indicate that the object of attention seems to already determine the action. And that really disturbs me already because Murdoch makes this argument that the focusing on the right action is already kind of like senseless in some way. That we've somehow um, we've done this sort of false parallel with right and good. And she wants us to refocus on the good. But for Murdoch, the good is indefinable and unrepresentable, which is interesting because now we come into a very epistemological dilemma where we think we can, through kind of salvational fantasies, in some sense, have the good, have some idea of perfection. And technology and perfection, I feel like, I do in some ways, I feel like some of us need to go back to Plato. I'm willing to do that. Because I'm currently talking to somebody that's really interested in Plato, and I think Thomas Jockin just joined a Plato study group. Because it's starting to haunt me that we already have ideas and fantasies of perfection, but that fantasy of perfection is orgasmic, in my opinion. It's this idea of like, yes, I will reach some final end with my perfection, but as Murdoch knows, and even Plato, there is no end to that perfection. The perfection is the sort of moral progress. So for me, the question becomes not even about rights, but more about because I think psychoanalysis already has done such a good job at showing the force of desire when it pays attention to something, that it already in some sense captures itself. Like it can't escape because of what it's attending to. And so I feel like this system that even Murdoch agrees by using psychoanalysis is that we can use that force of desire and redirect it to an object of attention. But the question is, and I don't want to make it just completely platonic, but of course you're trying to say the object of attention should be beauty because it's the only visible thing, but beauty is sort of derived from the good, which is not visible. And then, this question of like, what is the object of attention that should be done to sort of uncover and drive this? And I think Miller is sort of pointing to it in some sense by wanting us to slow down, because what I've noticed with technology is that we're ever shifting our attention. We're never really attending to anything anymore. We're just merely attending to our fantasies. But yeah, that's it. That's all I gotta say.
Delightful, Javier. I'll give it to Mr. Hunter Coates and Lorenzo. It is a treat to see you, my friend. I hope you're doing well. We are talking a bit about AI, but bioengineering. There was Isabel Millar gave a presentation on like AI and Lacan. We're also talking a bit here about what it would mean to exactly use the technology. What should use the technology? Desire? What would it mean to have a politics that's interested more so in the question of not human rights maybe, but instead what do we want? Because we have technologies to make human beings however we want. And I know you do such tremendous work on transhumanism, your presentations on Christian transhumanism, your work on conspiracy. So I'm going to put you on the spot and make you talk in a minute. But first, I'll give it to Mr. Hunter Coates. Mr. Coates, how are you doing today, sir?
Yeah, what's up? So I just want to reply to Javier. We talked a little bit on Instagram about this Murdoch thing. And one of the things that I said was that I posit a teleological orientation to action. Basically, I take that like when we act, we always act in intentionality. We have an immediate end, right? Let's say I'm reaching for a remote control. Yeah, it is very late stage capitalism. I'm reaching for a remote control. I pick up the remote control, turn the TV on. That's my immediate end. But maybe I want to, throw the remote control at my friend. That's my, end that's coming later. So I kind of think this is how we orient action. And when I hear Javier talking about how the good is kind of indescribable, it's like insubstantial. Well, what I would say is that Hegel was right to say that when we posit this, we kind of fall into the false infinity. We have to give the goal, we have to give the good an end goal, or else, because what he says to Kant's notion of the highest good, which is kind of what it seems that Murdoch is kind of saying, is that there's this highest good which is just beyond every good that we do in action. So Hegel says that this falls into the false infinity. Now I would say that the true good is a life of theosis and worship, right? So I would say that we come to this by moving away from technology, by engaging in a sense of, you can say, like contemplative prayer throughout our lives. And this is how we reconnect with what is good. We do not just do good actions, right? We engage in a more spiritual form of goodness that I think that Murdoch perhaps is missing. But I think this is a very Platonic notion, because in Plato, the true is the good. And I would say that God is the good and the true, right? I apply a Platonic concrete universality to God. So that's what I would say. I think I'm done.
Thank you, Mr. Coates. And I really like that shirt. Hegel on the canned soda is very nice. I appreciate that very much. That's very good. No,
yeah,
there is
I'll explain it real quick. It's so it says absolute spirit, and it's like a wine bottle. Spirits, wine bottles, absolute spirit. So.
Well, I know that many
Yeah.
people have gotten drunk reading the phenomenology of spirit, even if there's no alcohol around. So that works out very well. So Lorenzo, I'm going to put you on the spot and make you ask, what should be the standard by which we use transhumanist technology or AI or any of that different stuff with bioengineering? Because I know you do a lot in that field. And I'm also really taken, though, by this idea that you almost have a kind of revenge of philosophy, as Cadell is talking about very much. Like if we have the ability to basically choose whatever we want to do in some respects, or we have the choice of a politics that makes us confront our wants, well, then by what standard do we choose X instead of Y, right? What is the standard by which we choose X versus Y? You have the ability to make a decision, or you're kind of choosing these different things. So what do we enjoy? And you have to own your enjoyment. There is the question by how do you make the choice? Is it X versus Y? If you could claim, oh, well, we're doing it because it's a human right, well, then it kind of does the decision for you, or you have a framework to operate the decision in. But if it's more loose, if it's more free, then it would seem like you need some sort of transcendent value, like Mr. Coach is saying. But then how do you talk about first principles? And that almost gets into the Dr. Hunter substantive democracy about the ability to talk and negotiate axioms or different things. But Lorenzo, come on, you doing all right? You want to talk about transhumanism and all the work that you do? It's good to see you.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me. I'm glad I was able to finally make it. It looks like I'm literally the only one on the West Coast right now, because it's much later in the day for y'all. Yeah. So I guess the original question is how can we apply, like, is philosophy making a comeback because of the ethical questions that are arising because of transhumanist technologies? So I think that yes and no. I think on one level, one thing I'm noticing here in Silicon Valley is the popularity of the book What We Owe to the Future. But I find it really interesting because it's the first time, like, you don't really hear software engineers talking about Plato as much as you hear them talking about effective altruism, right? So regardless of how I feel about utilitarianism, I think it's good that at least that having conversations about ethics, like at a philosophical level, is cool again, in the tech sector. So I think that, I think so people are becoming more aware of the cumulative consequences of different design choices, whether, like the incentives behind social media, or whether it's, on more transhumanist technologies, like, whether it's, Neuralink and the like, and if we can get to bioengineering in a second. I think the other way in which, like, philosophy is not making a comeback is that I think there's a micro way and a macro way in which philosophy is ill-equipped to deal with some of these issues. I think the micro way is simply that most philosophers today are trained in kind of classical academic philosophy. And so if you read What We Owe to the Future, what's interesting is that it's not really using techniques and references that a traditional philosopher would necessarily use. It's using more what the rationalist blogosphere tends to rely upon, which is Fermi reasoning, and trying to use very concrete examples to make statistical probability estimates, right? Not that there's a discussion in philosophy, like there's a discussion about parfit and the Republican conclusion in what we owe to the future, but it's still, in a way, it's more understandable to the everyday person, but it's also the kind of logic, like even just understanding Bayesian updating is something that I feel like escapes most classically trained philosophers, right? So I think that's the microwave in which like a lot of contemporary philosophy does not end up being very helpful, because you do need more of this probabilistic reasoning that's strengthened by very different practices, whether it's investing or programming. I think the macro way is simply that, like the intersection between something like AI and genetic engineering, for example, makes it very difficult to actually make useful predictions about the future. So we can definitely, try to visualize the future, and effective altruists try to do this as much as possible. But when we're talking about the different ethics, we're also dealing with future decision makers to whom we may not be able to relate to, whether it's super intelligence itself, whether it's, whatever comes after Homo sapiens, whether it's a symbiosis between humans and AI. We know these things are coming, but then it's actually very difficult to make useful arguments, for entities, right, that have a vastly different cognition than we do. I think in many ways it would be like trying to explain Plato to an alien. Not impossible, right? But would they find it helpful and persuasive the way humans do, right? Because I think so much of the value of philosophy is in the historical context, like whereas like a machine cares about that very less, and you would probably read the Republic and say, ChatGPT would probably say I could summarize this in 10 pages, right? Because it's relying less on persuasion, in a rhetorical sense, the way we're traditionally as humans, right, used to kind of thinking about it. So I think that's why I think philosophy, again, it is making a comeback, because people are becoming aware of the ethical implications of these emerging technologies, but it's also not making a comeback because most of what's coming is this new form that's a little bit more amatorial. I would say I think maybe that's the thing to start with, right? I think it is making a comeback and not making a comeback at this. I guess it's in a different form that most academic philosophers would not even label as philosophy, per se.
Beautiful, Lorenzo. I appreciate that, and thank you for that. And Samuel Barnes, good to see you, sir. It's very interesting. There seems to be a great popularity of the effective altruism, but then there's a question of, is that a form of philosophy that has an appeal to the good without thinking maybe about the basis or axioms or first principles of that good, throws out value ethics, and does it also have a danger of, say, suppressing the real in the con, or the sexual desire, or like the motivations sort of kind of lurking behind those ethical considerations, or what we were also kind of talking about, because it's very interesting.
Hold on.
Go on
Given
ahead.
the popularity of polyamory within the effective altruism community, I think we can hardly say they're suppressing sexual desire.
Well, is that a split subject?
Actually, we can say that they're repressing. Actually, polyamory and just expressing sexuality without boundaries is also a form of repression.
Yeah, because it's interesting, Lorenzo, like that you have that kind of split subject, which is a good comment, because there's this idea of, oh, we can separate sexuality from rationality, right? Like we can have rationality over here in our technology and we'll have sexuality over here in our free time, when really the question is, how do they lurk into one another? And I know that you know that. And it's interesting, though, how then in that way, there's kind of like, oh, if we're doing the effective altruism, then we can enjoy polyamory because we're almost kind of moral people, right? And moral people express their sexuality morally, and how those things fuel into one another. Lorenzo, everyone, has a extraordinary TED Talk, by the way, on neurodiversity that I highly, highly suggest, tied with game theory dynamics and Nash equilibria. He also does a ton of work with, say, Christian transhumanism, and thinking about these questions of how can you think about the idea of these new technologies that are coming and taking them on seriously. We were just talking a little bit ago, and then I'll give it to Samuel Barnes and Javier Rivera. We were talking about a little bit ago about, say, the real of pronatalism, or reproduction, or anti-natalism. These are things that are there that are not being discussed that we need to think. Bioengineering is coming. These are there. These are not thinking that we're thinking. And it's very important to think them now before one day they just kind of show up and we stumble into it, because when we don't pre-think, then when it happens, we tend to be shocked. and the response can be very pathological. So I always appreciate Lorenzo's emphasis. He's been thinking about these things for years, and I'm going to pass it to Mr. Samuel Barnes, if you'd like to speak, Mr. Barnes, and then Javier Rivera. Mr. Barnes, it is good to see you, sir. I hope you're doing all right.
Hey guys, what's up? Yeah, I think the problem with effective altruism is it lacks philosophical balls, you know. It's just like going back to this kind of, you know, blank utilitarianism that's going to say, oh, we need to make things better. And it's what people who are saying these sorts of things, they're usually thinking in very scientific ways. Or they don't realize that, you know, even saying something, for something to be better, you need to have a deontological attachment to some sort of measurement that you're going to make better. So, like, I don't know, like a lot of effective altruists are just like, okay, we need to just raise the GDP and that makes things better. I've seen someone arguing that a shrimp is a great example of animals that effective altruists should protect because, you know, it doesn't have any of the, you know, it's not a mammal, so we can't relate to it in that way. It doesn't have like a cute face, so we don't relate to it in that way. So effective altruists are kind of like advocating for, you know, care of shrimp. And this is something I've heard an effective altruist themselves advocate for and say it proudly. But I don't know, like, you know, I think from thinking about these things, like, honestly, and not trying to just say, oh, we're just going to make things better. Like, it's so philosophically vague and doesn't have any foundation whatsoever. I, you know, my position that does have philosophical balls is that I am a human supremacist. And, you know, we need to do things that benefit the human race and benefit the human race in ways that we deontologically attach things to. Like, for example, like there's not a measurable benefit to making things around us beautiful. But as a human supremacist, I arbitrarily have the balls to philosophically say that is the best thing.
I hope you get a t-shirt that says human supremacist with like a little logo in the corner. I would really enjoy this. It's very interesting because there's something about the idea of, say, reducing pain for the majority of people that is appealing, right? I mean, it would say, oh, that's good. Then the problem becomes, though, determining there are some forms of pain that are actually good for people. Then, of course, there's the problem of trade-offs, right? In politics, it's all about trade-offs. Oh, you want more freedom? Well, you might have less protection. Oh, you want more privacy? Well, you might have more surveillance, right? And what would be the utilitarian way to go about thinking about, say, those political trade-offs? And let me give it to Javier Rivera. And then, of course, like you say, there's parts of struggle that's necessary for meaning. At the same time, there does seem to be truth to the idea that a plan that will reduce poverty, say, as much as possible is good. The issue then becomes, like, I do think there is a mistake, like where you say, oh, our intention is to reduce poverty as much as possible, and nobody notices that the aid all gets stuck at the harbor with the ships and never actually gets to people because the corrupt governments actually take it, right? There's all these questions of, a lot of people don't realize how much infrastructure you need for aid to even work. Like, if you're giving aid to a nation and they don't have rule of law, it might all get just stolen, it might be sucked up into corruption. So it's interesting to think that there's an argument, I guess you could say, that in order for altruism to actually be effective, it would have to remodel the entire socioeconomic and legal framework of a nation to assure that altruism is effective. Now, of course, when you have something like Katrina goes out, then there's the question of, oh, it's kind of clear, you know, I went down and put down floors and it's not effective altruism. That was not a term in 2010 or whatever. It's kind of clear what you should do. But then later on, people are arguing, well, aren't they just going to be flooded again? Wasn't that kind of a waste of aid or different things? So it's interesting how you do have to kind of be skeptical and critical of these notions that seem on the face of it obviously good, but maybe they're not. And there would be a question of if effective altruism within its own camp of resources are able to move into those questions of nuance. Not to say that they can't, not to say every effective altruism cannot, but that would be worth considering. I always am skeptical generally of utilitarianism. But let me give it to Javier Rivera. Mr. Rivera.
So one of my polemical takes is I think intention is bullshit. I think that's actually one of the banalities of altruism, is this ethics of intention, the fixation of intention. In my opinion, actions cannot determine themselves. They can only partially determine themselves in some type of fashion, right? Even if I slap someone, you could say, oh, that's the end of my action. But actually, that's not the end of your action. The person could slap you back, but you actually don't know the response of your action. So I'm just going to clarify some things when I say Plato, because I feel like this is actually some of the barriers with having philosophical conversations already. Is when I say Plato, everybody starts associating. He's like, oh man, this guy's going full hard Plato. All right. I'm not. I'm just saying that there's this concept of perfection that I think is still in society. Because I think even, like, for example, to respond to Cadell, I'm semi-hard Plato. Just half up. But that's right. So this idea of anti-natalism, right? It's funny because for them, the argument that you shouldn't have children because it's a dangerous world, that is perfection. It's better to not have children. That is their idea of perfection, in my opinion. It's a perverse idea of perfection, but it's the perfect response to a evil world, so to speak. And it's fascinating that the perfection is still haunting us. And the reason why I'm bringing up Plato again is because if we understand that beauty can never be possessed, then obviously that society doesn't have that concept anymore, right? Like Miller's talk, the idea that the Kardashians sort of become the standard for beauty. Everybody starts reproducing and basically mimicking as a copy the ideal perfection of what a woman's body should be like. And this is why when we go back to the idea of beauty and the good, we should at least understand that we can't grasp it. we can't grasp it, but the thing is nobody understands that we can't grasp it. And so that we think that we can. So technology, beauty, they all get intermeshed into a sort of blind reproduction against what they believe is to the ideal perfection and the ideal good. This is the only parts of Plato that I'm advocating for, by the way. Mainly because I phenomenologically see it in the world. When people talk about the way they envision society, and even apocalyptic visions seem to be perverse fantasies of perfection too. It would be perfect. It's just obliteration, annihilation. So yeah, I'm gonna just cease there.
No, it's very interesting because there is the question of optimizing for what? You could say you're perfect. There's well, actually, it may be interesting to consider effective altruism or value ethics. I'm also curious about Heideggerian thinking on this as well, because there is something about in the question, like Mr. Barnes on his YouTube has done work. He did a talk on the birth gap. There is questions at the store. They have the pronatalism versus anti-natalism. What is the best way to think about having children? Maybe that is kind of a concrete sort of example to think about frameworks, right? There's a lot of people right now that think it's unethical to have children. There's a lot of people right now that think we have to have children or we're going to have the demographic crisis of a lifetime. But aren't you kind of a monster to have children if global warming is coming, right? Like there are certain paradigms that all that all define what would be effective altruism, right? Like if the world is going to burn up in some fiery hex storm in 100 years, maybe it would be effectively altruistic not to have children, right? But are you sure that's the case? All these things kind of stir a little bit. And I am curious if maybe, not that we have to go in this direction, but the choice to have children or not to have children, and then you could argue if you were a Catholic that making that choice is an impossible choice, so you shouldn't give it to people to make, it should just happen. Maybe you go with that, maybe you don't. But of course, there's a lot of trade-offs with that. That also will probably be like if we're going to one day have to choose our freaking genes or genetics or potential bioengineering, then it would seem like the question of reproduction would be lower on the scale of difficulty before we can start working toward that. So it might be something to think, although no one has to reply to that. Those are just thoughts I have. Let me give it to Mr. Coates and then Mr. Jockin. Mr. Coates, please.
Yeah, so I am going to say I love that term, human supremacist. I'm going to use that all the time. Listen, I'm a Hegelian Platonist. I'm a huge human supremacist. I'm a Christian, we were created last for a reason. Anyways, so what I want to say is that I think that I think Plato's Republic, in terms of the actual state, also has a lot to say. I wouldn't say that I just think that Plato's notion of beauty being sort of indescribable, this like ineffable thing beyond thought is also important. But I would say that also Plato's actual political theory can do some work too. But what my main point is to say is that I think that intentionality is how we direct action. Perhaps not all action. I mean, I believe in the unconscious. I'm a Lacanian. But what the unconscious also has is an intentionality too. When Lacan talks about how the unconscious is composed of signifiers that works like a language and all that, these signifiers, I take it, have a sense of intentionality as well. Not in the sense that we do, right? But they have a purpose. They have a purpose in their signifying. Lacan at points in his career tried to divest this. He would say, for instance, that the drive objects do not actually reach their intended goal with the androgynous zone of the body, or erogenous zone of the body. But I would say that overall, Lacan seemed to think that these signifiers did have a purpose, right? So even if we posit the unconscious, as I would in an ethics, we still can allow purpose. We can still allow intentionality in ethics. And I think if you are virtue ethicists like I want, then you have to have intentionality, right? So that's it.
No, it's a lovely comment. And again, if my internet gets buzzy, I'm terribly sorry. The haze in Virginia, you know, it's a big enemy for the internet. But it is, I am curious between, I haven't wrote, I know Anscombe wrote a lot on intention. I have not read it, but I would be curious. I have like, you know, I have a file with a bunch of says, write this paper one day, and it's comparing Simone Weil's attention with intention. And I'm curious if there might be differences there, because what Simone Weil talks about is a kind of intention that seems to be an ethical act that also has kind of ontological consequences, if you will. And is there a difference between those two? I have no idea, but I do think about the difference between like the intention and the attention. But I haven't done that paper, so I don't know at this point. But it's a curious point. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin and then Mr. Thomas Wynn. Mr. Jockin.
Hey everybody. I'm actually back in New York visiting family. So fun times. You know what's so one thing I'm overhearing, especially on the natalism and questions about it, and what Lorenzo brought before about the effect of altruism, specifically its future testness focus, right? So 2 notes on that. One, and also I bring this up, I just had lunch recently with a good friend of mine. She has 2 kids. And also my other friends who all have children, all around 1 to 3 years old. So anyone who has kids knows that's incomplete. The amount of suffering going on, and it's not just like the obvious sleep deprivation and all that. It's actually the cognitive tension of not. Let me put it this way. I think ultimately everyone, as was hinted at before, but I don't think we really understand the magnitude at this point. People think life is not meant to suffer. They really think that. They think there's something categorically wrong if you're suffering. I actually make the argument just empirically, looking at people's lives. No, I think actually the norm is suffering. That is the norm. It's actually a moment of respite to actually have rest, to not suffer. Any attempt to make an illusion, and I think actually we have it completely backwards, and thus causing all the psychosis and what's wrong. I mean, I think actual psychosis in a way, because you're literally denying what reality is actually telling you. I say this because one, basically the argument of the moral claim that pain is bad and pleasure is good. So that's the entire argument of Unitarianism and every derivative generation of that. Suffering should be diminished or denied, and pleasure should be affirmed. Except that's not the case. Even when our sensibilities tell us, well, it shouldn't be that way. If you actually look at reality as it plays out, I actually told I'm bringing this point to ground this point to my friends. I told them, I think honestly, looking at my pattern, the pattern I'm seeing, I'm like, oh, you guys are just going to be suffering for at least 7 years. Like these kids need to be in basically at a point where you're going to have enough. The kids are self-sustaining enough that they're not going to be demanding your time and attention every single moment of your time. It will take about 7 years for this to happen. And then they have multiple kids, so this actually gets extended longer. And all the compounding problems of not time with your spouse, massive stressor, especially in an isolated social environment where you have no network, no relationships. So now it's all on you. The actual amount of emotional, psychological pressure these parents are going through is immense. This is not, again, as beyond even the physical challenges of raising children. So I think actually fundamentally any moral systems making an argument that no, suffering is bad and should be mitigated, you actually, under that line of argument, that's the justification. Forget even the question of the kids, of the world being basically, you're going to bring kids in the world in a place that's global warming, whatever. No, I actually think the arguments here, if you claim that suffering is bad, has drilled all the way down into relationships. I see it. I can see very clearly the rational argument people make. Well, no, why should I suffer that? So that's kind of the question. It's all because that's ultimately the answer to this point. No, if the world is suffering, that is the reality, and actually the respites of pleasure or non-suffering are actually the blessing, quite frankly. What is it for? Because as Nietzsche says, anyone will suffer for anything if they have a purpose behind it. So that's really ultimately the question. And that's, you know, I think anyone who comes from a religious background will understand that. That's the idea of raising children, is that, oh no, they're actually the most important gift of your life. Because yeah, you're gonna suffer now. But that's true with almost isn't that true with anything with virtue? Especially because we're all broken and lost and we're all stuck, we're all full of failure and vice and error, that it takes cultivation. And actually the whole point is that you're gonna suck for a very long period of time. And then eventually you, from repetition of habits, you can become good. And you get all the benefits of that. You get the treasure of something that's cultivated. And normally things that are cultivated hard, they're very difficult to acquire, are usually things that persist. Obviously not permanently. This is why Aquinas says in this world we can never have pure happiness. Because that's also the point, but as to bring us back to the original point of we can't have the good here. What we're aiming at? Well, generally the answer is for human beings, it's happiness. Of course, we don't even know what that means anymore. Because we just think it's this sensation. Again, notice we have completely reversed ourselves. Not to say the good should not have pleasure, but all these caveats I'm bringing up, and also just people's lived experience, I'm seeing, I don't think we have the intellectual equipment. I don't think we have the frameworks. So I think basically we're going to collapse self-generally collapse if we don't address these systems, like these fundamental misunderstandings of how to orient ourselves to life. I just see it from my friends' lives. And lived experience. One last note, and especially I bring this up, is that isn't it interesting too? Because there's no about future tenseness. All this idea of the project about the future, what's going to happen in the future, doesn't exist actually. You know, versus what actually exists, which is now. Maybe kind of humor a little bit on Heidegger's point about being in time. But anyway, that's a side note. I'm going to stop. I went on a little rant, so I'm going to stop now.
Thank you, Mr. Jock, and I appreciate it very much. And, you know, I must say, like, the first time I heard about and read some of the long-termism thinking on the notion that there will always be way more people in the future than it has been, and is there any kind of moral obligation to them, I don't think on the face of it that is necessarily bad thinking. And in fact, I was hearing some of the people at the Stoa who are the pro-natalists, I think Bandcamp, whatever, they were very interesting, and they were talking about how that can be a reason to inspire people to have children, because you don't want to be bringing people into a world or in the future where there are not children to take care of, because there also is a question of if you avoid the pain and difficulty of having children now, or maybe you just end up like Japan, where all the suffering comes for the older people that have like no friends, no connections, and you have this kind of decline that occurs when you have declining birth rates, where maybe you avoid the difficulty of having children, but then it just comes on the end. So there's also a question of, can you actually avoid the suffering or just put it off and it comes in a different form, right? There is also the issue that if some people are having kids and others are not, that means it's almost like people are in different worlds, and it's harder to have a shared intelligibility that can be leading to the atomization and different things like that. And so, you know, it is also, well, it also just goes to show you that what is your conception of the human being that you are being effectively altruistic relative to, right? If you say, well, it's reducing pain, what kind of pain? And there is also an issue that utilitarianism seems to has use on a certain scale, but the question is, if you bring it down to a nuanced scale, does it become too blunt to be useful? And maybe it's just too blunt in general to be operational. I'm not sure. And then there's also the issue where, you know, Cardinal Newman once said that words don't tell you what they mean. Likewise, when you feel pain, it doesn't tell you what it means, right? You have to decide what it means. And the experience of pain seems to say in itself that it's rational to get out of this. Well, in order to resist that response to pain, you would have to have some sort of framework in your mind to counter that natural cause and effect, which then would say, where do you come from? Do you have that? Do you not have that? And there could be issues. But let me pass it on to Mr. Nguyen, Mr. Rivera, and then Lorenzo. Thomas Nguyen, it is a delight to see you, sir. I hope you are doing well.
A pleasure. Yeah, I like what Thomas said at the end about making Heidegger a side note, because maybe I can try and make that the footnote for my 5 minutes of talking. It's nice to be thrown into this conversation and be thrown into ethics, because it's been a while since I've engaged in this. Although I had a voice note from a friend the other day asking, like, what is Kantian ethics? How is it grounded? Like, how do you ground it? How do you ground it? And I was like, that's the question, you know, how do you ground happiness? How do you ground? And I was saying, maybe because people say that Heidegger has no ethics, like in praxis, but also in terms of his work, he doesn't talk about ethics. But I think in a way we can read his later work on letting be, building, dwelling, thinking, and we can actually find an ethics from this. So as Thomas was speaking, and Javier as well, Like there's this inclination for me now to say maybe we can, I think what Cadell would say, like think the political real through a notion or a concept kind of after Hegel's project, after Heidegger's project, after Nietzsche's project, because then we're not approaching the question of like childbirth in Japan is like, okay, have as many children or have none, you know? Because I think instead it's about a different quality of thinking what it means to cultivate children and how we relate to children and how we relate to the world that we engage with, you know? I don't think moral responsibility is clean. And I think this is what Thomas said, like, we need like an intellectual apparatus to think in such a different way what it means to introduce an action. Like from what I've been reading about AI now, like this is just advancing so quickly that nobody has a single idea of like what could happen. Like there's so much space for like possibility that it's just really loose, and you know, so that's the question, like how do we from the side of philosophy engage with the unknown possibility of technology? I think there is a responsibility, but not according to very simple notions of what morality means. I think instead it should be really focused on concepts that we know are inconsistent. They have an element of mystery, they have an element of contradictoriness. But I think we can engage in some concepts still today, which do, in a way, this is the utilitarian, like maximize something. And I think what interests me the last weeks and the last months is to think Heidegger in terms of, so basically he would talk about specifically in building dwelling thinking. So like I opened it then, like in the last page, he talks about housing crisis in Germany after World War II. And that's the last thing you'd think Heidegger would talk about, but he talks about on all sides we hear talk about the housing shortage, and with good reason. Nor is there just talk, there is action too. But we try to fill the need by providing houses. This is what politics is in a way. It's like there is a social need and we need to do this. Heidegger in his way goes on to talk about, but the real homelessness is the fact that we're not thinking the question of being, our relation to the clearing. But he admits in this text that what it means to build and to be with dwelling in a way requires housing, like it requires to be let be with a house, like so you can sit in the house and have some time to think the question of being in a way. And I think that's where politics is in that sense. It's like, how are we maximizing somebody's possibility to be with themselves in a way which is not being like, or just the reduction of exploitation, the reduction of alienation. And in that sense, like the concept of freedom comes in again, you know, like absolute freedom. But what does that mean? That doesn't mean that a corporation can rule the world. I think it means, and this is maybe the thing that I'd like to hear, like this concept of releasement, of letting, maybe that can be a way to understand what it means to take action in the world for the other in that sense. Like if I engage with you, I know that any action I do will have an effect, like it's, you know, desire, all of the repressed notions of engaging with the subject and object. But if I know that maybe for my own self-relation, releasement or letting has a really nice outcome for my own self-enjoyment, which I think it does on a personal level. And this goes back to our conversation, Daniel, about like the grace of letting be in the cypher and hip hop and opening up to see what happens. I think in the political realm, that is the concept that we can bring in today, is to say, okay, if I let you be, it doesn't mean I pull away from you and just like don't talk to you. It means I engage with you in a different quality. But that's the question, how do you put that into politics? And having housing for everybody is a start, because then it gives people that let be time to become a Heideggerian, basically.
No, I love it, Mr. Nguyen, and I would love if on the next city council meeting where they're debating affordable housing, there's a Heidegger citation. I think that would be the best. Yeah, just like it'd be like, well, Heidegger said right here, so it'd be really good. And Samuel, the band, they're a YouTube channel that does a lot on pro-natalism. They're very nice people in at the store as well. And it's interesting because using the housing example, it seems like effective altruism or utilitarianism in general is a fair and useful framework when you're dealing with people don't have houses. How do we maximize the amount of houses that people have? But as you move up from, dare I say, third world nation problems or poverty problems up to, say, first world problems, which is how do we have a home where, say, the family is together and they're not always mad because the dad is repressing something or relationships are falling apart, right? That's when it seems like utilitarianism might overfit. But since it was so effective on the way up, maybe, then perhaps you're tempted to think it will work here regarding first world problems, because maybe it was effective getting everybody housing, right? So it's interesting to think. But then, of course, what do? We say, oh, those are first world problems. You shouldn't talk about those. You should, oh, you're having trouble with your relationships. Well, at least you have somewhere to live, right? There's a kind of shrugging it off, like discounting of it. So as a result, we don't think it. And then it becomes moral to just think the effective altruism framework, as opposed to maybe seeing it apply on more problems that are more given by facticity, if you will, like not clean drinking water, not having housing, not having stuff like that. But as you move up the scale, you have to move to some sort of different ethical framework that we perhaps have not thought, precisely because we haven't had to until this point. So that might be one thing to go about it. But it is very true. Like, it's hard to have a home if you don't even have a house, right? So once you have a house, though, what is the way of holding oneself or carrying oneself to create a quality? So maybe it's also the movement from quantity to quality in policy or thinking. That is a movement from utilitarian to value. I'm not sure those are thoughts, and I know you can't break them up so cleanly, but I'm always looking for polytheories as opposed to monotheory, a single theory of everything, a multitude of theories to use in different conditionalities. But let me give it to Javier Rivera and then Lorenzo. Javier, where's your cat? Are you going to pet your cat?
Oh man, no, I can't. My cat's not near me right now. Yeah, so I really like Wynn's take. I mean, this is kind of like the take I've taken from Buber on the notion of waiting. But then I realized that waiting and letting is not just a kind of physical position. It can be, but it's this idea that you're attending to something. And the question that, again, keeps haunting me is that, what am I attending to? And perhaps we have to wait for that too. I mean, I don't really know. But I want to go back to this idea of intention again, because I think actually me and Hunter fundamentally agree on the conclusion. But there's something interesting about our concept and understanding of intention that Murdoch argues here. Just like you said, Daniel, you have to decide what it means. And that's my problem with intention in some sense. You have to decide what it means when you examine yourself, when you perform an action. And like Murdoch says, you actually can be mistaken about your understanding of what your intention is. Now, I can sense the kind of discomfort, but it doesn't mean that there isn't some type of inner dialogue. Now, I think Hunter pointed to the idea of why he wants intention. He wants intention because intention indicates direction. But what I'm saying is that you can still have an interior monologue without the notion of intention. You have an understanding that something is directed at something. But to me, even action, in a real sense, that why do you want to do a good action? Why do you want to pick a good action? There seems to be something more than intention determining the action. That's what I'm trying to get at, that there's this direction that wants to do more than the action. We do actions because we want to achieve we have some vision of something, right? Utilitarianism, altruism, we have some vision of something. And this is where I feel like we're at some Pascal wager here. But my interpretation of Pascal is actually a little bit unique, because the way I interpret Pascal now is actually you throw away your position and wager against the position that is most uncomfortable for you. And you can see a society that's so based on utilitarianism, they're afraid. And altruism, they're afraid. They don't want to bet on anything else. They can't imagine that. But what Pascal would say is that you lose nothing from this, right? If you decide to do something else, you lose nothing from this, because fundamentally the position that you're on isn't a nothing, is a kind of nothing. But the real sense of danger is that you can lose a nothing. This is the kind of double nothingness that I interpret with Pascal. The other thing that was brought up was this notion of, Thomas brought it up, with suffering and pain. Now, this is where I'm like slightly Hegelian, right? When they talk about the whole discourse, I think people have the right conclusion that you want to avoid suffering and pain, However, here's one fundamental factor. How do you determine what you should avoid if you don't first understand suffering and pain? How do you determine what is unnecessary suffering versus necessary suffering? How do you determine what is necessary pain versus unnecessary pain? It seems like they have completely fooled themselves into thinking that here's pleasure and here's pain. But actually, they have no understanding of what unnecessary pain actually is, or unnecessary suffering actually is. What they're actually avoiding is just plain and simple, like Jochen is saying, is just suffering. They're just avoiding suffering. Again, I agree with their conclusion that they want to avoid suffering. But in fact, the people that have an understanding of suffering, they know how to avoid unnecessary suffering. And the only way to avoid unnecessary suffering is by going through suffering, right? This is like the sort of ironic tautology that you get caught up in. And yeah, and if we want to think freedom, in my opinion, almost take like a Lacanian kind of notion too. With Murdoch agrees with this too. Freedom is freedom from fantasy. We know the self is riddled with fantasy, and so the only understanding that I have is what can we direct attention away from the self? What is it that we can direct away? Because it seems like Thomas is saying, like, I let you be, but the preoccupation is that I can't let you be because I'm so focused on myself. I want everything to sort of configure and to myself because I find myself so interesting with my Latina butt. But anyways, I'll stop there.
No, it's very interesting. I'll give it to Lorenzo. You know, I think of Jesus because it's interesting. Jesus is taking care of the poor. He's trying to reduce suffering for the hungry, but then he's also dying on a cross, right? So there's this interesting example of different kinds of suffering. Jesus is not like, oh, it's good for people to be hungry, but then there's also a notion of it's good to suffer in some way. So there's this interesting, but right there, of course, that would kind of demand metaphysics and maybe ontology, because if there are different kinds of suffering, then what is the standard by which you tell those differences? Maybe there's a difference between a forced suffering, you're just born without food, and that's what, would be good to maybe use utilitarianism to stop. But then there's a chosen suffering, or a suffering where you choose to suffer for something, maybe in a Nietzschean way, that seems to be necessary for the human being, actually. There is something about choosing difficulty that seems to be important. And maybe the issue is the difference between politically removing unnecessary suffering, which I know is idealistic and you can have unintentional policy mistakes, but just grant me that for now. In order to make maybe spaces, maybe in a kind of waiting until it comes forth of a suffering that then you choose, right? Like there's a kind of getting rid of the unnecessary suffering, taking care of hunger and food and blah, blah, blah. But then not making the mistake of overfitting, and that meaning all suffering is bad. Let's assume you don't make that mistake. Now you've created the clearing for then it seems for people perhaps to wait, in the Buberian sense, for a kind of suffering to come forth that then they choose. This seems to be, if I move my hands like this and it means something, remove, clearing, choose. And if that choosing doesn't occur, something seems to be lost. And maybe that's where it's like the choosing of children becomes a big deal. Like there's a conviction, like if you don't choose children, there's something that is lost in the human being. And it would seem like there has to be a movement in ethical frameworks to think those just come to mind. But let me give it to Mr. Lorenzo. Mr. Lorenzo, it is good to see you, sir.
Before I make my comment, I just want to say it's the first time I find myself flowing a conversation, as in taking notes like a high school debater. So yeah, props to you guys for such an engaging discussion. So I kind of want to start at the top with Daniel's comments on effective altruism. One thing I want to point out is the fact that one core philosophical assumption that effective altruism makes is that just like most utilitarians, there is no act-mission distinction. You're morally responsible for not saving a life. I think that's what makes effective altruism a really important philosophy for the government, like at a macro level, right? Because it is true. There is no such thing as a neutral choice when it comes to government action. So it is important to maximize impact, in a way that's you can be held accountable through measurement. Individually, that can be different. And I agree with Sam's point that art is something that an effective altruist would not necessarily finance, but something that I think that's why I think there's a difference between like an individual and like society more broadly. I think you would want to be a virtue ethicist in an effective altruist society. I think that would be potentially the mixed equilibrium in that respect. But on the no act omission distinction, I think that's very important because I think it is related to the anti-natalism conversation. Because for most of human history, having children was considered to be something that just happens, that people didn't really have a control over because we didn't have modern reproductive technology, which I think illustrates kind of what I wanted to bring up at the beginning about the idea that it's difficult to anticipate the ways in which these technologies will change what it means to be human. If you ask a scientist 200 years ago where they thought birth control was possible, they probably weren't even moving in that direction. It's not that they would think it's impossible, it's just they didn't even think about the fact that you could research such a scientific thing and have such control over such a primary biological process. So, and I think you have this contrast between anti-natalism feels short-sighted, whereas the long-termist, right, is about, well, we need to have enough children to get to the cyborgs that will, cohabitate with superintelligence, right? And again, I think this does go back to this idea that I think it is important to think that to have a long-termist outlook, because the ethical consequences of our decision-making in the present is not limited just to us and our immediate people, but it does in some ways radically influence the future. One of the examples that Will McCaskill makes in What We Owe to the Future is of the Quakers pushing for abolitionism and all the personal sacrifices that they've made, to push for that belief, and how there is nothing obvious about overcoming slavery as or like enslavement as a process, right? So like the personal sacrifices you can make, like I think most of the time are not justified if you're looking for short-term impact, because it doesn't work that way. And I think that's ironically how effective altruism can be a little bit self-defeating, because not everything that is measurable is important, and everything that's important is measurable. And the biggest acts of heroism, in a Nietzschean way, are things that echo throughout history, which makes sense on a long-termist perspective, but it's not something that you can quantify and empirically demonstrate, right? And having children, I think, is an act of hope towards the future, because I think what we need to acknowledge, right? So this is maybe where I disagree with some of y'all, is that, don't get me wrong, I think having children on net is a pretty good experience, right? But we, as a species, we haven't really thought about it as a voluntary choice up until recently. So I think it is worth questioning to what extent do we engage in self-deception when we have children? Is it a necessary component to put up with, all the sleep deprivation or like the first, 10 years of their life, right? Because I think if we're not willing to acknowledge all the reasons why somebody would want to be an anti-natalist, right? Like we don't even discover ways of potentially improving the parenting experience, right? Such as, for example, I think pretty much every guy that I know that has had kids, it becomes more passionate about childcare, becoming accessible to everybody, right? But then I still think fundamentally that my conclusion on the whole general conversation is that I don't think it's actually that clear that it really makes sense. And I get why society has been telling people for a long time, oh, don't worry, just do it. It will make sense in the long run. You'll be on your deathbed, you see all your kids coming to love you. Like, no, but what if your kid is a drug addict? What if your kid turns out to be like a frat boy who rapes a girl in college, right? Like, there are all these other ethical problems. I think that's why fundamentally having children is an act of hope in an uncertain future. You're betting, because here's the way I kind of think, that's why I think long-termism is actually very important to defeat anti-natalism, is that it almost doesn't matter what your children know. You have to think about your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, and their descendants, because they may be part of a chain process, because we're all here because somebody managed to reproduce, right? Like fundamentally, there was an unbroken sequence, right, of our ancestors, right, reproducing. Yeah, like, and I think it's important to think like it's the chain. It's not even about what the experience is going to be like with your children, right? Even though you want to optimize that for sure, right? But even if it would be terrible for you, even if objectively from a utilitarian perspective it would be on net negative, messing with the chain, I think is very problematic. Like you're taking on some existential risk that becomes really problematic. And one example I can really give of this, that's part of a lot of my research and why I'm passionate about bioethics, is that the ways in which reproductive technologies have been used in unintended ways by parents, right? Selecting, for example, male fetuses in China and India that now have inverted population pyramids because of this. Like they profoundly messed the sex ratio of their own population, even though it was a bunch of individual choices. It wasn't top-down mandated, right? It was a bunch of individual choices of the parents, right? Whose emergent consequence was a population catastrophe. With genetic engineering, the issue becomes a little bit more subtle because if you have, I used to think, women would have natural moral qualms about terminating a pregnancy just for evolutionary reasons, right? It turns out that clearly that's not the case, as if you see in some of these countries that the culture can override that a little bit. But when it comes to genetic engineering, it's much more subtle. You're not asking to terminate the fetus. You're just asking to either select an embryo over another or use CRISPR to change genes in a particular way. And all of a sudden you end up in a world with no depression, which sounds great in theory, but then what happens to poetry? Not to say that poetry requires being depressed, but I think all of you artists, adjacent people know that it's driven by outliers. And fundamentally, the instinct to stabilize society is to suppress outliers. And in the only way I think we can fight those kinds of risks, which I think are existential threats to humanity, is by taking a long-termist perspective.
Thank you, Lorenzo. No, it definitely seems in hybrid. Good to see you, sir. You've definitely done tremendous work on the game theory dynamics of these kind of choices and how you can get an emergent result that is a Nash equilibrium, a suboptimal result, or a rational impasse, a problem that rationality cannot get you beyond this problem because people arrived at it by their very rationality and individual choices. And I think actually you make a very good point. I think it's actually been a huge mistake to emphasize with, say, having children that, oh, your life will be fulfilling, oh, you'll be happy on your deathbed, because you're actually kind of appealing to a utilitarian standard in that very act. You're saying it will increase happiness if you do it, when really it might be more of a term that I've used before and Javier has written on, a kind of absolute choice, where you choose it and it is its own grounding for its own sake as an end of itself, because you are choosing for human beings to be the beings that reproduce and deal with that difficulty, because that is the ontological reality that is most fitting for children. So it's an absolute choice in that it is a purely free choice that has no rational basis for it whatsoever, and yet it is made as its own ground in a sort of apophatic sort of sense. But then the question would be, what the heck does that mean? How does the average person think about a concept like an absolute choice when that's not something the average person has had to think? And I think it really does come down to this issue where we haven't had to choose reproduction. We haven't had to choose babies. And the only way that makes sense is if you have some sort of concept of an absolute choice. As I call it, like a choice that is its own absolute grounding, really. And why would you choose that? Because you do. Because you do. And then there's this ontological status that comes with that. But no, and I think also how this opens up questions.
Well, Daniel, let me add one thing to what you said, because I think it's important. I think it's also worth exploring this philosophically, because there's the emotional angle of how do we convince people to be parents right now, right? But pretty soon, we're going to transition as a species into a world where we will not necessarily have the natural impulse to reproduce as much as we've had up until now, right? It will not be something that you would by default want, because your AI side of the brain, is optimizing for, no, I want to achieve immortality, for example. And that's will be you see what I'm saying? Like, I think that there is the emotional conversation about, yeah, you have this existential commitment to this uncertainty and it justifies itself. But then I don't think that survives the philosophical scrutiny. Is like, how do you convince, like a homo deus, right, to reproduce anyway in a world where they don't have to?
No, I think it's a very good question. If you're immortal or there are technologies to elongate your life, would you want to have children continually? I mean, the more and more you change what the human being averagely is in terms of intelligence, lifespan, whatever, all of these questions come up. And I think that's a bit what Isabel Millar is getting at with Patipolitics, and a world where like more of what we are politically discussing is very much tied to choice. And it would seem like more and more absolute choices that are their own grounding. I think what you just brought up there, Lorenzo, is a very, very important point. I'm going to pass it to Thomas Jockin and Javier Rivera. Mr. Jockin, please.
Yeah, Lorenzo, I mean, you made up excellent points. I mean, this was outstanding. I completely blanked about the birth control side of the equation, which is absolutely the first. I mean, to really sit up and think about it, it really is a transhumanist movement. It is. It's direct intervention on our biology. And the note I had, let's meditate about this. If one of the things we've been in the philosophy group, we've been discussing AI, right? And more importantly, the change of incentives that are going to happen by AI basically accelerating in its development and its application in the commercial marketplace. Birth control, we already have the case study. Look how much society has transformed and changed in about what's been 40 years, 50 years, around that time period. And the restructurings in law and society and all these dynamics in play because there's a restructuring of incentives. And Lorenzo, you made some great points of people are going to absolutely, like, the more I edit, this point is actually getting me, I'm getting strong energy in this topic because I think we human beings absolutely need necessity. Like, we need the force of necessity onto us. I don't think we are not God. We do not deserve full freedom. We don't deserve it. We don't deserve it. We do not. We're going to destroy ourselves. That's my hot take point. Because all these points of like, we're just messing around with just like aborting the children, quite frankly. Like, let's get real, because that's what's happening when you have basically, if it's a girl, nope, we're not having this kid. These just small choices are causing literally demographic skews, just that act alone. Once we get to the actual gene code and you attach it to the echo chamber of social media, like the Kardashian, basically, like we're going to social engineer our babies to basically be Kardashians. But like the ridiculous over the top. I don't know if you've ever seen those things where like women get plastic surgery to look like Barbie, or like these kind of like over the top echo chambers of social media, social signals of status and association that have no external social pressures of environment, but only social cognitive of the society. This is going to be a disaster on this exact point, especially as you said, Lorenzo. We can't have outliers are generally all failures. They're only successful a minority of the time. We're making a gigantic gamble that we're going to let this aggregate out to the populational level effect. I don't know, man. I mean, somebody talk me out of this claim and challenge me on this point. I have no problem with that, but just drawing this out, I just think, quite frankly, human beings need a force of necessity. And it's true. Children raising was a force of necessity. And actually, meditating on the point, because of how much we're thrown into freedom now, I actually what I love about children is exactly that point. That you are now compelled to care about another existence that's not your own. That the entire psyop of a self-interest, self-image, as Javier said, that the self-image of oneself, your fantasy, and society in reality, external reality is supposed to conform to you. The children are absolutely going to tell you, no, that is not the case. And of course, here's what happens. A lot of parents, no parent really wants to admit this, but it's true. I've seen it in my friends. The resentment, the core resentment that this force of nature is compelling onto you that your priorities, your interests, your care does not matter in any way. And if you neglect this, you might kill a life, by the way, or at the minimum, have the social shame of neglecting your children at the minimum. So all these factors combined together, quite frankly, that's why I love children. It's exactly that point. It's a reminder of it. And also, usually almost every like hardworking industrialist person who ends up having children, almost all of them say, oh, priority shift massively. And there's also secondary dynamics about that, but whatever. I'm just saying, and I see it too, because I don't have kids yet. And I see my friends that their kids, I spend time with them. I'm like, this is what matters. This bullshit of like making more money for some corporation, who gives a shit? That's a whole nother, exactly. And look at like the entire artifice of our social structures. So the closest point, again, Lorenzo, I really appreciate you being on this call. I think you're making some excellent points here. This whole the bio hacking of trial raising has completely already demonstrated at the level we've already had that most population needs. We need compulsion. We're not deserving of freedom. We don't have the equipment for it. I don't know if we're ever going to have it. Maybe it's absolute knowing. God knows. We don't have it at the minimum. And most likely, if ways are going, like I sent Javier. I'm going to close on this one point. Javier, remember that thing I sent you this morning, where it was anyone over 30s looking at the Zoomers who are on TikTok with those simulations, like basically you girls are like getting paid to simulate like being a toy, like a NPC toy. This is all, I forgot the term for it. It's basically like a hyper stimulus. These are all literally, they're just hacking the brain of these hyper stimulus. And it's not just humans have this property. Any animal will have this. They have examples of that where they like over exaggerate those attractive features like over the top, like completely out of control. Like disproportion doesn't make sense, and all the animals really attached to it. There is no. I'm almost 99% convinced we're going to end up in that direction. God help us. I'm going to leave it at that.
You don't want a world where everyone's married to their Tamagotchi? Okay, that's fine. That's your opinion, but that's fine. But no, there's many times where Lorenzo has visited and we've almost locked him in the garage. He's a beautiful soul. So thank you, Lorenzo. And Dimitri's essay on the spirit child is very good, Mr. Coates. I would highly suggest it. He has a wonderful video on it as well. And it also, I think part of the issue, and I'll give it to Javier and then Mr. Coates, is the notion of if I choose something hard, people can look at me and say, that guy's an idiot. But if I face something hard that I didn't choose, because say you have children, you didn't have birth control, then there could be a nobility in it. The problem is we don't know how to honor people choosing to do hard things, because that would kind of be the social condition that helps people like feel kind of at home and unalienated with it. What ends up happening is that when everyone can make their own individual choices, there also becomes knowing what other people think about your choices. And if you choose necessity, since it's not necessity, you chose it, then people can accuse you of being an idiot. They can alienate you and say, well, you don't hang out with your friends anymore. It's like, well, nah, because I'm taking care of the kids. Well, that's your fault. You chose that. And so suddenly there can be an erosion of sort of these necessities that can be a source of nobility in different things that people do to one another. So there also becomes this issue. I do think if we look at Berger and Reef and all the sociologists, basically human beings do absolutely struggle without necessity. If there's no necessity in their life whatsoever, they devolve. They do very, very badly. Well, what does it mean to choose necessity and to have a society that sees that as necessary and still honorable as opposed to irrational? That would require a society that's open to values beyond rational calculus. And unfortunately, we have a society that has a lot of autonomous rationality going on. But let me give it to Mr. Javier Rivera and then Mr. Hunter Coates. Mr. Rivera.
So yeah, I mean, I agree with Jockin in the sense that we need necessity, mainly because right now our conception of freedom is basically fantasy. Our understanding of freedom is rooted in fantasy. You need necessity to possibly break and understand what freedom is until you break that fantasy. Basically, you wouldn't have any understanding of freedom until you break that fantasy. But actually, Lorenzo is actually reminding me how there seems to be like a theological phantasm going on with technology, meaning the anti-natalist argument is the same theological problem theists themselves struggle with understanding, which is the idea of how can I choose something and then yet something is already determined for me? How can something, like I would call this technological destiny versus choice? And I think what the anti-natalists see is that technology has already determined, and the world has already determined that it's a bad state to even have children, right? So I'm going to choose against this destiny. Now, I think this problem between the fantasies of some technological destiny and choice is the same problem that a lot of like just kind of like common day theists have a hard time understanding. They're like, how can I make a choice and then yet I'm already determined in the end? How can I possibly strive for salvation if God already determines who's going to get saved, basically, right? And so theist goes, well, there's no point, right? there's just no point now, right? It's already determined. He already knows I'm going to sin. He already determined my fate from the beginning. And so I feel like there's a sense of that in our age when we talk about transhumanism and technology and the sort of vision concerning the end, whether it be apocalyptic or it be paradise kind of vision. The other thing that I've noticed in the shift between what Isabel Miller was talking about was that now we're doing a shift from working for enjoyment to now enjoyment works for us, right? Enjoyment, that seems to be like the kind of switcheroo that we're doing now, where we're trying to get enjoyment to work for us. And I feel like that video that Jockin sent me was exactly that. That enjoyment is working for us now. And Also, Lorenzo's idea about how ethics sort of misses the long haul picture. I agree. And this is why time is such a super important concept that I feel like most ethical conversations never discuss. Like, it's always like, okay, was the action wrong? Was it good? Okay, condemn him or save him. It basically always stops there. It never goes any further than that. And this notion of calculation, this is why I like Derrida just for a second here, where he talks about the concept of pure forgiveness. People can't even fathom the concept of pure forgiveness these days because it's a concept that you have to calculate, right? Do I forgive this person? Did he do everything in the right way so that I can't forgive him? Or maybe I'll forgive him just to sort of appease my ego because it causes too much stress and it's stressing our relationships and so on. Derrida calls all of these reconciliations not forgiveness, because those are all calculated actions. And I feel like the same thing happens with sort of the anti-natalist thing. They're just trying to calculate everything and making sense of it. There's no sense in a Derrida way. There's no sense of the impossible, which you could say is hope. And I would say like kind of like a hopeless hope, striving for that impossibility. And this is why at the end of ethics, and this is I have a difficult time removing the theological stain because I just haven't found an answer for this idea, that this concept of forgiveness and grace and mercy and so on. It's such bizarre concepts for people. But for me, forgiveness and mercy, those are at the end of ethics. Those are right at the end, but those are ethical actions too. And that's why I'm struggling, and people don't have a sense of that mercy, forgiveness. It's just bizarre. It's a kind of madness, actually. Like, what, don't you want to forgive him? Like, no, that's dumb. And then it reminds me of how Plato talks about how love is itself a kind of madness. And Badiou talks about how love now, the way it's constructed, it's a safe love. It's a guaranteed love. The whole dating website sets you up. You're going to have a nice, safe love. You'll find your partner, your perfect match. No sense of madness. It's too much. It's too real. There's a sense of this idea that love is a kind of real, a kind of touch with the real. But yeah, those are my thoughts. I'll leave it there.
Javier, it's your fault for not buying the $9.99 monthly package. Then you would have found you went with the free version of the app. That's why it didn't work, Javier. If you only would have known. I mean, come on, man. But quick, first, I love how you said just to talk about Derrida for a second. I promise I'll go back to hating him, guys, just for a minute, okay? Just for a minute. And then second, before I forget, and this came up in Isabel Millar, the most Lacanian thing ever to happen, perhaps, in the collective consciousness of the world is the release of Oppenheimer and Barbie on the same weekend. I want everyone to understand that right there, that says so much about the collective state of the world, and that came up. Lastly, and then I'll give it to Mr. Coates and Lorenzo, I do think I'm very curious about these topics where something is peeking through, some sort of problem. And I think forgiveness, because it is very difficult today to have a doctrine of forgiveness if you don't believe, say, in like a God that forgave all your sins, right? Because how do you know if you're enabling evil versus doing something just, right? A lot of people are like, you're forgiving them, you're enabling evil or something, right? So forgiveness, grace, like how do you have grace for people? Wait a minute, maybe you're contributing to injustice. Having children, reproduction, that seems to be another one. There are these issues, and then maybe AI and so on and so. There are these issues. And forgiveness is one that the great Embrace and Exclusion, Wolf, he writes on, that's quite good. There are certain issues that seem to unveil something, that something is kind of breaking through of a certain inadequacy of finite calculus in our reasoning. Not sure we'd have to think about that, but I think a lot about the issue of forgiveness. I think that actually points to something of significance. But let me give it to Mr. Coates and then Lorenzo. Mr. Coates, please.
Yeah, so I have a couple of points to make. The first one is I sense a lot of people when they make these, I know Zizek talked about this once, where you look around and people who make these types of like doomsday things, climate's going to destroy us all in 10 years, there's this clear sense of jouissance which is being derived. It's very clear. I mean, they are enjoying thinking about this. They are enjoying thinking about disappearing, maybe you say death drive, whatever you want to say. There's this clear jouissance. It's not just like this we are trying to make the world better. It's this clear, I get enjoyment from thinking about this. And sometimes I make my way into the cesspool of analytic philosophy of ethics. And sometimes I yeah, so sometimes what I see is like these talks where they're like, okay, so let's say you have 5 buttons in front of you and one of them launches a nuke which destroys the entire world. What do you do? Why are we talking about this? What? Like you are enjoying the thinking about destroying the entire world, and that's why. I mean, there's so many papers in analytic philosophy of ethics, which are these insane scenarios which never happen. And I can't help but think they just enjoy just thinking about that. So I always make that point to my analytic friends in ethics. But so second thing I want to say is I wanted to talk a little bit about the pure forgiveness thing. So that's an interesting thing from Derrida. What I would say is that I would tie what Kierkegaard says in Works of Love into this. What Kierkegaard says is he says, okay, let's say you can't love your neighbor, right? For whatever reason, right? He says, okay, put on a blindfold and then love whoever's around you. So the point would be just to negate all classification of loving people and just love the neighbor, right? Matthew 27:28. But what Kierkegaard is trying to say is that just put a blindfold in front of you, right? Like if you can't say like I love the neighbor, just put a blindfold on and just love whoever's around you. The whole point is to say that we're trying to remove these distinctions. I think Derrida's idea of pure forgiveness is interesting because you could try and create a doctrine. You could create a secular doctrine with this. I mean, a lot of people take Zizek's the end of the spirit section. Yeah, it's spirit because it leads into okay. Yeah, so the end of the spirit section of phenomenology, where Zizek talks about how you where you have the mutual forgiveness on behalf of what was once the master and the slave, which went through all different archetypes, but the mutual forgiveness between the master and the slave, and then you have to have this in order to have an ethical society or have a just society. So what is to say is that there are some moments of forgiveness which just have to be done, and these moments of forgiveness are not like, they can't be rationally planned out, they can't be like quantified, like, well, you've done this much, I've done this much. That's against Hegel's point. His point is just forgive. I think he says that he quotes a verse in Matthew on the same page where he says that like when you forgive, the Spirit is in your presence, or when you forgive, God is in your presence, or something like that. So yeah.
Excellent, Hunter. And Javier, we got a Kierkegaard reference. That was good. I like the blindfolding thing. And also, we here at the Net love trolley problems. We think they are so productive and help us problem solve in very useful ways. Yeah, I like what Javier, the trolley fantasy. That's hilarious. I'm going to use that. That's really good. Let me give it to Lorenzo. Lorenzo, please. Oh, the internet's treating him like crap now. Yeah, I know. There, go. Throw it. Throw it against that wall where they're doing all the transhumanist work behind you at Silicon Valley. Isn't that where they're doing all like the secret operations? Michelle, please, and then
really wonderful discussion, everyone. Great to be here with you all. See all of you. Grace, our daughter, did like my makeup, so that's why it's so flamboyant. But I was like, that's fine, girly, we'll do it. That's great. So yeah. But I wanted to say that I think the birth control topic is very important. I'm really glad it got brought up, and I think that the only people who really took it seriously in terms of like, oh, what might the ramifications be, you know, down the line, was really like the Catholic Church. Really, like there was the encyclical by Pope Paul the Sixth. I can't read Roman numerals very well, but he wrote an encyclical on human life, and basically was asking the questions about, you know, what could the trajectory be of you know, and just basically like default using birth control. So I really think it's an important encyclical to consider and read, especially for the human supremacists out there. But I want to say that two other things came to mind where I was thinking about, like in high school, how a lot of times some of my friends who were girls were put on birth control because the doctor told them that it would make their cycle less painful. And so I was really wanting to speak to the suffering point, that a lot of times the technologies are utilized or are at least paraded around as like making things easier. Like, you know, you won't have to deal with as bad as cramps and all of that. And so I think that's really interesting that the approach for that technology is to like make it not as hard. And I understand like suffering is very real, and I'm not like making a judgment on using it for that only reason, but it's the framing of it taking away like that difficulty and providing ease that I think speaks to this whole idea of like, we denigrate suffering as a part of, like an essential part of the human experience, like pain and suffering as a part of love and a part of life. So I wanted to just say that. And then also I think birth control is interesting because we can never really separate like birth and death. So it's interesting to think about birth control as also a type of death control, where we kind of like get this illusion of control with it. And ultimately there's like, it's kind of like you're saying, Daniel, where maybe the suffering just shows up somewhere else. I think that's absolutely true, because a lot of times, like these girls I mentioned from high school that I knew, like later on in the years, just in keeping up, sometimes they would talk about like how, they felt a major disconnect like with their own body because of it, because it completely basically disconnected the brain from like their reproductive system. And there was no awareness of like their own cycles and the different phases of it. But the point of the matter is that there was kind of I saw some other unintended consequences of its use, because there was kind of this reliance that like, oh, like it'll be easy, and like then I won't have to worry about sex and all of these things. But it really caused a lot of like, it unleashed a whole nother set of like challenges or sufferings, I would say. And so I think that's really important to understand that, anytime you get like, you sort of like take, make it easier here, you might be setting yourself up for more difficulty elsewhere. And then the final thing is I'm always interested in the word like convening and convenience, because I think those words are really fascinating. I think anytime we get convenience, we often trade convening, like communing, for convenience. And the problem with that is like, then we don't realize that we're like sacrificing the actual convening. And with sex, then it would also be like conceiving, right? So it's like this connection between convenience, convening, and conceiving. So basically, I just want to say that we it's easy to talk about like, it can be, we kind of maybe can miss the point about talking about the actual like aim and teleology of sex as it actually enhances a relationship itself and like the fullness of its expression. And I think that openness to conception had something to do, at least like from the encyclical's point of view, it had something to do with the fullness of that, the expression of that relation. And that always kind of held space for the mystery, right? And the uncertainty, but that's also what made it kind of like maybe more alive potentially, but also potentially more challenging. So I just want to speak to those things, and I hope, that can leave some food for thought. But yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you, Michelle. And I'll give it to Lorenzo because he has to go in 10 minutes and his internet died on a very sorry about that. And then Mr. Thomas Wynn. And no, I think we have to think in trade-offs. We don't think in trade-offs. We just think in problems and solutions. One of the keys to mature thinking, is moving in the direction of trade-offs as opposed to problems and solutions. But Mr. Lorenzo, please.
Great. No, I'm glad we're talking about forgiveness and the user experience of motherhood, because I was thinking that we're talking about, I think the best way to Steelman Anti-Natalism is Beloved by Toni Morrison, because I think that's such an interesting ethical scenario that I thought about a lot ever since I read the novel, because I was like, because I looked it up, and actually, in fact, a lot of female enslaved females were not killing their own children. Which you would think, I'm not saying it should happen the majority of the time, but you would think it would be a lot more frequent, given that they were giving birth to children that were going to be objectively brutalized, abused, raped. Like, so in a way, it kind of feels like the ethical choice to be a parent, right, should be, well, no, I don't want to bring people into this, multi-century concentration camp, right? And yet that's not what happened. So one explanation you can give is that it was just an evolutionary biology story. Just the motherhood instinct is so strong. I don't think that's true, because there's a lot of evidence across species and across humanity of infants being abandoned. Actually, in fact, like one reasons why the Catholic Church had to started orphanages, right? Was because so many newborn infants were abandoned, because that's what we used to do. And as brutal of a practice as it seems, to the modern day, it was very commonplace across most of human history. So clearly, mothers are evolutionarily programmed, because animals do this too, so it's not just a human thing, to abandon newborns if they feel like they're not going to be able to raise them, or it's too complicated to raise them, right? So why didn't the female slaves kill their own children the way beloved, kill their own children? And I think part of it, it speaks to this idea of like, well, I'm so glad so many of them didn't, because part of what's beautiful about African American history is that it is a journey of hope, right? Is that if you decided to, have children and have that courage despite the circumstances, it's not as if the world immediately got better, but generationally, there was so much progress, right? And I think Roots shows that so wonderfully, illustrates that so, right? And I think that's the journey of hopefully humanity, which is why, if you think about it, despite all the reservations we could have about birth control today, it would be regarded as a miracle to ancestral people, because the alternative to birth control was abandoning newborns, because they didn't even have chemical abortion, right? So we're further in abstracting away the problem. And I think if we have to take antinatalism seriously, we should, I think the answer is going to be in trying to figure out, here's the way I kind of think about this. How do you convince somebody 1,000 years from now to still have children? Well, it would probably be likely that if you were able to find an argument that worked 1,000 years ago that still worked today, that then the argument would persist, right? Because it would be Lindy, right? So that's why I think about that whatever argument worked to convince women to reproduce and not kill their own children, or abandon them, right? Throughout human history, like even in the deep ancestral past, right? Where it was even more materially constrained, is probably, right, related to the argument that we need to make for Homo Deus, right, to keep reproducing. And the last thing I kind of wanted to bring up, two more things. So first, one thing that became clear to me in this conversation is that on some level, long-termism is necessary. It's a necessary precondition to have demographic awareness. Because if you're not engaging in the long-termist logic, you wouldn't be able to notice something like the sex ratio in your population being compromised, or your population pyramid being inverted because of selective fertility practices. So at least I think that can be one of the wins of long-termism. Is like it is necessary, at least at that level, just even become aware of some of the potential consequences of our actions that if we focus too narrowly, wouldn't be able to. And that's why related to that, I think that, Daniel, you brought up this idea of like, we need to acknowledge the suffering to make parenting more morally praiseworthy, because I agree with you. I think that because we used to think of children as something that was inevitable. I mean, children is something that was inevitable, and that's what society had to control it, so they would be in a monogamous union to promote, the welfare of the child. Now, right, like we used to take it for granted. Now we think it's a bad thing, which is the only thing worse than taking parenting for granted, right? So I think that we need to find it more morally praiseworthy, and I think we should acknowledge it instead of trying to basically shit on the antinatalists, right? I think the answer is to actually elevate parenting and motherhood specifically even more today. And I think part of it has to be with realizing that everybody who's having more than one child right now is taking one for the team. And so we have to think about, how do we communicate with those people? And one stat I think is relevant to this discussion is that, ironically, the number of people that don't have children is made about the same. It's about the same percentage of the population. What has changed is the number of people who want children have had. Now, what's causing this? There are all multiple, explanations that I don't want to get into right now, but I think that's something that's worth kind of pointing to, is that there have always been antinatalists. There have always been, dual income, no kids couples, right? What's really leading to the demographic collapse of our civilization is that people that want children have less of them. They used to have 4, they now have 3. They used to have 3, they now have 2. They used to want 2, they now only have 1. So I think that is the conversation. Is like, if we try to directly tackle antinatalism, we're almost not addressing the right audience, which is, how do we almost have to convince people to have more kids as opposed to having to convince people to have kids in the first place, which is related to kind of the last point I wanted to make before I leave, because I really liked Javier's language that, antinatalism is a choice against destiny. I kind of want to flip that around. I think having children is a choice against destiny, because the destiny of most species is extinction. We see this in the archaeological record, right? And so in a way, it's like shouting in the wilderness, right? Because at some point, like your unbroken chain of reproduction, will end. Personally, and this is something else I want to kind of bring up for this, is that I think what I do to kind of argue against my anti-natalist friends, or like that tendency, is that point out to them like, okay, so if having more children is problematic, why not adopt them? Because that way you're not creating new humans, right? And objectively, by adopting a child, you're putting them in a position to thrive and minimizing their suffering. That person already exists, right? One thing I found that has been really fascinating is how when I started sharing about, I personally feel called to become a foster parent, mostly because I just don't have the issue with it that clearly most people, I just don't have the hangups. Like, I'm not against, breeding or whatever. Like, I'm just not like clearly most people have an issue with it. They hesitate around it. And I realized that because I don't have those hesitations, that's precisely why I should do it, because there's such great need. And I would say systematically, some of the most interesting responses have been from my effective altruist friends, because it totally messes with their logic, because they're like, oh my gosh, this is an extremely effectively altruistic act. But then why is effective altruism not talking about this as much, right? Effective altruism talks about donating your kidney to a stranger more frequently than it talks about foster parenting. But who instead vibes with the idea of foster parenting from the get-go? It tends to be my Christian friends. Even though I ironically use that as a criticism of a church culture's obsession with using the church as a matchmaking service to get people married and to have children, because what happens to women, their fertility window, right? Which is a reality that's becoming even more commonplace. The church doesn't seem to have like a good answer to that. I mean, I guess the Catholic Church does, because the answer has always been the same. But I think like a real kind of more modern outlook would be to, I think, encourage more couples in the church to form, regardless of age, and create a support system for foster parenting, because the kind of church that is able to support foster parenting so much that more of its members decide to do it, is also the kind of church that in the process ends up building the infrastructure to support all parenting for everybody involved. And that's what changes the cultural perception that having kids just destroys your life, because you just see how much the church ends up supporting, like across the board, the most extreme use case.
Thank you, Lorenzo. I appreciate that very much. And thank you for coming by. I know you have to run, so it's a pleasure. I'll give to Mr. Rivera, Cadell Last, and Thomas Jockin. Oh, if you choose to have children, then you must give an explanation for why you didn't adopt. But if you don't have children at all, it's okay. Which, of course, would be odd in a different way, but that would have to be elaborated on. But Lorenzo, I appreciated your point very much. Let me give it to Rivera, Cadell Last, and then Thomas Jockin. Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, I mean, part of the anti-natalist discourse too is this idea of trauma, which I hear a lot, right? Like, I don't want to have children because I don't want to traumatize them. Which is, to me, is such an ironic, I guess, reason. Because it just, I mean, I don't know. I think it has to do with this idea of a cure, that it's like, I can postpone my production indefinitely because I have trauma. At least this is some of the argumentation centered around the idea. I mean, of course, there's always the economic argumentation, but I've heard this from a lot of mothers too, and you see this kind of ethical kind of passing around on Instagram and TikTok. It's like, why would you have children when, you're so messed up, basically, right? Why would you have children? And then you get this sort of ethical kind of demand or implication of like, you shouldn't have children because you're so messed up. You have trauma. Now you're going to traumatize your kids. And now that's a bad idea. Now you're doing worse. So it's actually better for you just to not have children. And then so we get obsessed about this idea of like, what I've been hearing is you get mothers that want to have children, but they realize that they have trauma. So now they're like, okay, I'm going to try to, get rid of my trauma, basically cure my trauma so that now I can have children. But in my opinion, this is only posts it posts the having children indefinitely so. Because I think with mother subjectivity, you're always going to find some type of element, some type of flaw to not have children, basically. you're always going to find a reason to not have children. And it's that overt rationality that is always going to give reason. But what's interesting to me, like kind of like Lorenzo pointed out, is that reason kind of goes both ways. And this is where like reasoning and ethics is kind of a little bit bizarre to me, because Pascal kind of points this out too. It's like reasoning, you can reason both ways. What the danger is that you don't want to wager on something. You really don't want to wager and choose a sort of nothingness. And it's funny that the anti-natalist argument is similar to like a Pascalian wager, where it's like, okay, so if you're saying the world is bad already, right, and everything's going to end up in death and sort of be apocalyptic, and you're saying it's better to not have children, well, I mean, in some sense, there's really nothing to lose in terms of the status quo and the way you interpret the world. Okay, if you have children, then okay, right? It's going to be horrible. There'll be trauma. There'll be death. It's the same, almost the same position, in some sense, in the more of long-term way. It's still apocalyptic. It's still hopeless. It's still a kind of remainder of nothing. So what are you saving exactly by not having children? What are you saving? There seems to be some type of salvational element to this that is just kind of bizarre to me, because it doesn't make any sense. The reason why they don't have children is because the world is so bad. So what's the salvational element here that you're trying to not have children? I'm like genuinely confused by that, because it starts from a position of nothing. I don't know, I'll leave it there.
No, I'll pass it to Cadell and Thomas Jogging. No, I appreciate the steel manning, because there is this very strong idea, like he's saying with Beloved, like if you're going to have kids and bring them into slavery and brutality, isn't that immoral, right? Or this kind of, I mean, a lot of people, I think, follow this global warming, economic well-being, there's misery, suffering, et cetera, so forth. So it would be immoral to do, right? So there is an argument to, as well, Mr. Coates, good to see you, sir. And then I'll give it to Cadell. I mean, it's very important to steel man it. And there is this, well, it could just be the case that you can't make this choice. Precisely because there's always reason not to, or could, and if you make the choice, it has to be an absolute choice. It would be better not to make the choice at all. But I think it's also true that people who have traumas and haven't done inner work are having children. I know Cadell has said children are having children, and that's really problematic. So there's an idea. But then the problem is people are maybe putting off having children and not doing the work of becoming like adults, right? It'd be one thing if people were using the technology to do the work, but then something else if they're not, and then we can't generalize. I'm not speaking to everyone. So there seems to be some important, an important cutting up, some slicing here that has a nuancing that has to be thought of. But let me give it to Cadell Last and then Thomas Jock. And Mr. Cadell Last, I like the shades. They look good, sir.
Yo, thank you. And yeah, great to be here. So I'm going to go off this concept of anti-natalism for a second, because I actually have like, I mean, I think it's like the most productive line of thinking that I mean, I think there's just so much interesting thinking here. I want to start by saying I think psychoanalysis emerged, and Lacan says as well, like that psychoanalysis could only have emerged in a post-religious secular scientific universe. And it's kind of this the reason for that, I think, is because it's like this recognition that there's a gap between what Freud would call the sex and the ego instincts, that there's a conflict between the sex and the ego instincts. And religion actually unify, that's what it tries to do, I think, is unify the sex and the ego instincts, is to get to ego, basically. And this is the whole paradox of religion, is that it's quite evolutionarily genius, is that it gets the ego to submit to the infinite chain of sexual reproduction in some sense. Whereas the neurotic, I think, is just questioning this gap. Like, why do I have to submit to this fucking thing? Right? And just going nuts about it. But like following Millar, she's saying basically now we're a society of psychotics. And what does that mean? Well, I think what it means is that, well, the technical definition of a psychosis is it's a foreclosure of the master signifier, which you could say is a foreclosure of God or a foreclosure of the Father. And so basically it's like going from questioning God, as a neurotic is doing, to saying that there is no God, basically, and not participating in God. So that brings me to what was said, I think, by OG, that we have to create an argument to convince people to reproduce, and that we have to think like and actually think in that direction, basically to participate in and as God, basically, in this sense. But to me, the big mystery is that the child, to me, has to be thought as a category, not just biologically. It has to be thought spiritually as well. And that's following Zarathustra in my reading anyway, that in some sense there's no choice about the child, that the child is biological and spiritual already, like, and that's really, it's in some sense seeing the structure of spirit. So I just want to say, and again, if I'm too long, stop me, but so my first paper I ever wrote was about the end of biological reproduction. And it was just because I saw this decline in reproduction, and I just thought, this is an evolutionary paradox. It doesn't make any fucking sense from an evolutionary point of view. But if you think in terms of trade-offs between the biological and the cultural, that actually we're putting all of our energy now into the cultural over the biological, and we see the cultural and the trade-off between the cultural and the biological as one we're not willing to make, basically. And then there's another vision I had, which started my whole doctoral thesis. And here's the vision. If you imagine chimpanzees or dolphins or any organism in an evolutionary way of thinking, 5 or 10 million years in the future, it's easy to think that. It's likely that there will be something like a chimpanzee or something like a dolphin. It won't exactly be a chimpanzee. It won't exactly be a dolphin, but something like that. With human beings, I argue, you cannot think that. We change too fucking dramatically on increasingly ridiculously short timescales. To the point where, like, imagine like the like ancient Egypt is 5,000, like, I think, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but like 4,000 or 5,000 years it existed. Whereas America's like 200 years old, goddamn. Like, can you imagine America 4,000 years old? Because I fucking can't. It's like, I can't even, like, in 100 years, man, like 100 years, this planet is going to be different as hell. It's going to be different. That's what I think. And so let me just read this one. Let me read this one line from the Acree I read today. It was just devastating. Actually, I want to put this in relationship to what Thomas Jockin was saying about the psyop of self-interest. Just let me get it. So he said, the world is now an immense community caught between democratic anarchy and narcissistic tyranny, grounded in the thinking man as an individual, in service of machines, and war as an organizational midwife. This is a devastating quote. I think that we're still fucking there, man. Like, we're between democratic anarchy and narcissistic tyranny. And then the individual as a psyop is in service of machines, and war is the organization. That's where we get the organization from, is just wars happen. And if I look at my life, I just saw Oppenheimer yesterday, so I'm kind of biased thinking in this way. But if I look at my life, if I look at my family, its organizational foundation is always related to death and war. Like personal war causes the organization. And so this brings me to my critique of John Vervaeke's dialectic to dialogos. So I think dialectic to dialogos is wrong. And the reason why, and Lacan said it in the opening of this paper, is that the problem with dialogos since Socrates, he says this, since Socrates, is thinking that reason can overcome aggression. And it's wrong. Thinking cannot overcome aggression. So Lacan says that we have to elevate aggression as a non-rational truth. So this is my point to OG. We have to elevate aggression to a non-rational truth. So it's not about pro or anti-natalism, but about elevating aggression from a self-interested violence to the truth of the species. And I think that's where the real work is. It's how is my violence being sublimated, transmuted towards the species being? And that, I think, is maybe where I would say maybe that's where we locate Samuel Barnes' idea of human supremacy. Maybe. But to me, ultimately, it's about a becoming other through that process. And that becoming other, I think, will include a post-human dimension. It's not about human versus post-human, but I think just naturally, that to me is going to happen.
Thank you very much. A few things. One, I want that line read at the next State of the Union. Two, there was something funny here where it's almost in the same way that, look, if people before the printing press were trying to think of man after the printing press, or before the printing press thinking about man after the internet, there'd be a post-humanness to that, the difficulty of thinking that. And maybe one of the reasons we don't think reproduction is because it would require us to think real difference. And real difference sucks. Because, once you have to think that, it challenges you in who you are. I also definitely think, and I'll give it to Mr. Jockin and then Javier Rivera, I definitely think there also is a danger in believing that you can overcome human aggression with dialogos, with thinking. Because once you think that, it will be gone until it isn't. And then when it isn't, it's really bad. Like, we all tend to be really nice when we have electricity, and then we lose electricity and we're pretty grouchy. The human element of the real tends to come out. And I think it is very important, like on any emphasis on wisdom. And certainly there are people in I know Peter Lindbergh has been talking a lot about wisdom, and I don't think he would oppose this. It's the idea that wisdom has to be real wisdom is a phrase I've been considering, like a Lacanian, like you have to take seriously the real of human beings and not think that you can achieve a wisdom that makes the real go away. That's always been generally. Some of the better tragic thinkers have always critiqued some progressive projects, and the best progressive thinkers also have not avoided the real. They've said you can never get human beings, just when you think human beings are beyond the aggression, just when you think they're beyond the real, that's when it comes roaring back. And there is something funny about human beings that just when we think we get rid of something like philosophy or aggression or economics or whatever, then it comes roaring back. Then you have the financial crisis. Then you have the power go out. Then you have the war. Then you have philosophy come because it has to deal with AI. It's just when we think we're done with it that it turns out it's not done with us. And I think it is very important to keep that in mind. And I always love that thought experiment of the dolphins being around 10,000 years, but it's hard to think humans. That's really, really, really productive. So let me give it to Thomas Jockin and then Javier Rivera.
So Lorenzo stepped out. One thing he said a couple of times, I think also because I made a report about the problem of effective altruism is that fact of future tense thinking and not dealing with the materiality of it right now. I'll pause. He's not here to hear this, but he's absolutely correct that wisdom is about time. It's actually temporal in that nature, right? Wisdom is supposed to deal with one of the measurements of it. It seems to be its judgments and its principles. It's guided by. Exists true as holding true over time. They're not apparent truths. They're not apparent pleasures. They're not apparent goodness. They don't just disappear basically over some time duration. Which, by the way, kind of leads to what you're saying, Danny, which is about trade-offs, right? So the question of raising children or having children is the basic, and I think the question does come down to trade-offs. What is our priorities? You don't get to have everything. Which is actually kind of like we had to summarize what is one of the ultimate psyops. And Cadell, thank you for picking up on that point. Is the preposition or unlimited potential, that there is nothing definite to us. There is nothing to be chosen to exclude, because the whole point of decision is demarcating. It is the breaking off from possibility. So I'm just thinking about those notes. One last thing by Javier, by the way. So you're making that comment about people, I don't want to say strong to say a psyop, but the rhetoric of trauma, right? This question of if I have my trauma, right? Isn't this another mode of like, I'm not ready, I'm not prepared, right? Now, the economic one is a reason I think we can understand that. I think that's a more reasonable point. I think that's I'm not going to talk about that side, but that's definitely one side of the equation. But the trauma is the other side, the spiritual side. Javi, you said something prior, right, about the people's desire for perfection. I think it ties exactly to that, because specifically on the point of their self-image of being good, that when you're the trauma, you're the cause of the trauma, you are the source of the evil onto something innocent. Now, is this not an effacement of your self-image that we're actually good people, that, well, we're good people? But in actuality, any older religious traditions will tell you this. That's actually the ultimate folly. That's ultimate pride. Because actually the truth is, no, you're not good. The fact that you didn't do good yet is only because the opportunity is not presented itself yet. Different religious accounts would say the only reason you're not doing evil right now is because God's giving you grace, basically to prevent that from happening. And you're actually fully able and willing to do all evil. Actually, one of the moments of wisdom is actually understanding not of illusion that you're thinking you're protected from evil, from ever doing it. Like, I would never do that. How do you know that? You have no idea what you're capable of. So as I'm meditating on this point, connecting what you said earlier, Javier, I think it's a false pride. I think it's a complete pride. I'm being very judgmental. I feel as an energy. I don't know. I just feel there's so much at stake. I apologize for the energy of this my whole session today, because I just have friends living through these experiences right now. And as you know, Lorenzo made a great point. It's totally true. The whole point, like, yes, there's been obviously the institution of nuns and priests were exactly on this point. Not everybody has children. You can have a perfectly great life without having children. Not saying that, but the people who do choose to have children, right? They're not having enough, and there's consequences that are coming from this. And I'm like witnessing in front of me this gigantic car crash of all these implications of the cultural givens that were there to help structure. And to me, as you know, as Cadell said, like, religion is fantastic. It's an amazing technology because it mediated these contradictory energies that were mediated to actually create something that has existed and has caused this acceleratory development, as was said, right? Ancient Egypt was 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. There's a big question: we're going to still have matter as a body in like 200 years at this point. God knows. Yeah, I'm going to close on that note.
I really do like what you said as well, Mr. Jockin, on the contradictory. I definitely think we have not thought really how religion has worked as a psychotechnology in those different ways that you described. And I definitely think the energy that you have is very warranted, because we've experienced this as well personally. And I do think, like Cadell said, that this issue of the reproduction is really, really alive. And it's really, really like pointed, like any possibility, like you did that very kind review of Belonging Again, any topic of address will have to discuss, for me, forgiveness. It has to discuss the reproduction. It has to discuss the social conditions and kind of the choice of which goes into all these things in ethical systems. So I think it's an extremely live issue. But let me give it to Javier Rivera, Cadell Last, and then Mr. Fishman. Mr. Rivera.
So yeah, this idea of reproduction, Rosenweig actually makes a really interesting claim on creation versus reproduction. And he talks about how he goes, it's kind of funny that we think, for example, an afterlife is sort of ridiculous. But he goes, actually, it's actually creation is more ridiculous than afterlife. Because he's saying, like, afterlife, if you think about it, is just like this continuous reproduction. There's just continuous reproduction. But actual creation, this sort of creation out of nothingness, he goes, Rosenweig says, there's nothing that we've created out of nothing. It's been just pure reproduction. So he makes this claim that, and this is what the spiritual child kind of made me think about with Cadell, is that we can't even fathom a spiritual child as creation, because it's merely now just reproduction. And when you think about that, yeah, in some sense, it is kind of like an afterlife. Like, why bother having children? Like, it just doesn't make any sense now. It's almost like asking, why would you have children in paradise? In some weird, ironic way, it's like, why would you? Everything's perfect. You probably have sex without having babies. You know, it's pure enjoyment. This is the fantasy of of heaven sometimes. It's like just this pure enjoyment. But like I keep catering to is that you have no epistemological salvation. There is no epistemological salvation. That's like the whole irony of salvation, in my opinion. Is like all the notions of religion talking about salvation is that, yeah, you'll be saved. But there's nothing about saying that you're an all-knowing subject. Nothing says that, in my opinion. And so I feel like that's like a really bizarre problem for me, because then it's like, how the fuck do you know you're in salvation then? How would you know if it's actually salvation if you don't have epistemological salvation then? You wouldn't really know. And that's like a problem that's like really been bothering me. And I think it's straight links into anti-natalism, where it seems like this kind of perverse paradise where it's like, actually, it's just better if we bar this paradise and not bring it into the world, where the abstract child becomes this transcendent thing that you can't bring into the world anymore. You can't let God touch earth, essentially. And it's weird that it's like that. And on Cadell's point about this rapid acceleration is super fascinating, because I'm like, I keep thinking of Plato's comment in Phaedo, where he talks about how wisdom, when we talk about language, wisdom sort of language has no epistemological value if it's not centered in spatial temporal timing, like Jockin talked about. So we can easily encounter this problem where we're reproducing so fast and progressing so fast that wisdom has completely been vanished from us because it's so distant. It's just completely been annihilated because we can no longer trace back the spatial temporal kind of associations that we had in the past. And this is why I liked Lorenzo's argument about, like, look, if you just look in the past, like, people had babies and they were slaves and there was no hope almost. Like, why would you do that? And the more that we progress, it seems more and more bizarre that you would do that. And that shows how language itself already has no epistemological value, at least when we're talking about wisdom, because now we have to convince someone to have a child. and there's like it's almost like we're beating our heads against the wall, because there's, again, the wisdom was rooted in a kind of spatial temporal setting. And this is why religion comes back to haunt us again, because how does religion remind you of that spatial temporal setting? It reminds you of ritual. It reminds you of contemplation. The fact that the child was kind of like an object of like celebration and baptism, right? Like, this is the child. Like, it was like a communal event. Like, a child is a communal event. No longer is a child a communal event. It's more like a individual self-narcissistic burden. And I find that really troubling. And I think that's the spirit of the child that's missing, is that it's supposed to be a kind of communal event of celebration, really. We can still imagine this, in my opinion, without the theological notations, but in my opinion, we don't have a sort of celebration of the child as a communal event, maybe like baby showers, but I'm pretty sure a baby shower is just like a woman's subjectivity still feels very alone in having a child, despite the sort of little semi-rituals that we have for like baby showers and stuff. But yeah, I'll end there.
I appreciate that all, Javier. I'll give it to Cadell and Mr. Fishman. And no, I think that well, there's a bunch of things. I mean, we moved from the nuclear family, from the traditional family, and we actually think those are the same thing. Where the traditional family had the immediate family was all around. You had community. Capitalism had people moving off to different cities where they're kind of alone, and then you're raising a child without the shared intelligibility of people having a connection to that. This made all things very, very difficult, these massive demographic and economic changes. There's also an issue where people like overly moralize, like they guilted people who didn't have children. They out-othered them in ways that was immoral, and that was problematic. And then there's kind of a pent-up response against that. So there's a ditch on the side of moralizing children, like if you don't have children, it's bad. But then there's also a massive problem in turning having a child into some sort of selfish, neurotic, you don't care about the, you're taking food from another child somewhere and you're contributing to the apocalypse. There seems to be ditches here that have to be navigated. And I like what you were saying on ritual, but I'll give it to Cadell and then Mr. Fishman. Cadell, please.
All right, so I want to start. A lot of this is the main point I wanted to make was in response to Thomas Jockin's, I think, great point about the self-mirage and you are not good. But I want to start with what I was inspired by from Javier, because I feel like this sounds a lot like my experience of Bard's worldview, which is hyper perverted. And strongly anti-natalist, and also I would say separatist in regards to men and women. And the book that we were gonna write, and I might release it one day, was titled Absolute Negativity. And I wanted to think about that in the context of what Javier was saying about language has no value without space and time. Because if you think about what has no space and time is a black hole. And I think that basically a black hole is opening up in our society. And this black hole, and that's why I called it absolute negativity, because basically it's pointing at this black hole. And what this black hole is to me is and this is what I argue in the book, is it's a gap between the elder and child. That the elder and child are getting torn apart, and we're losing the elder and child bond to the point where our knowledge is becoming senseless, because actually our knowledge is dependent on the elder-child bond. Our knowledge, our entire reference point for knowledge is built on that bond. So if you lose that, you lose all knowledge, and that to me is the black hole. But this connects to this idea of the self-mirage, you are not good thing. And even to the point where what the self-mirage that says I'm good is, in my view, is your specular image pretending there's no black hole. And there is a black hole. so that's a problem for your self-image. so this, and this is in relationship, and this is again in relationship to, I think, Jockin's point about you are not good, is that one, the other can hurt you, right? And so I'm talking about this, and now I'm going to talk about this specifically in the context of sexual intimate relationships. So like the first time I was 19, you get burned by a girl, right? The other hurts you. But then to me, what was even more painful than that was you burn the other. That's more painful. To me, that was like, that destroyed me. Because I had to, like, is basically what Jockin's saying is like, yo, I am not good. Yo, I am not good, bro. Like basically. And that experience, that, now this was years ago, but like that, I'm just saying that experience was the most important experience. And again, it just brings, anyway, that's what I wanted to say.
That's excellent, Cadell. I'll give it to Mr. Fishman. I definitely think that one of the values of religion was that they'd be like, you're a sinner. And actually, religion was in great despair if it started emphasizing, oh, you're part of the in club versus the out club, the us, but you're saved, you're part of the, you're the Christians and everyone else is doomed or whatever. That takes away the sort of reflective element that's very, very important, because the moment human beings forget that they're a sinner or they're imperfect or they're prone to hurt other people, that seems to be not a good recipe for human beings. But let me give it to Mr. Fishman. Mr. Fishman, it's good to see you, sir.
It's good to see you guys. Yeah, so a while back, Javier said something about how we need necessity. And it struck me that, like, if you need necessity, then you already have it, right? Like, you already have something that you need. And so to me, the problem is not that we aren't needy anymore, right? And I think that people in a modern society where we have our basic needs of, like, food and shelter met, phenomenologically, we experience the world as being more needy than like somebody in a hunter-gatherer tribe, right? Somebody in a hunter-gatherer tribe, you ask them, what do you need? It'd be like meat, shelter, fire, water, right? And it's like, okay, how are you going to get these things? Well, I'm going to go hunting and then I'm going to build a house, right? And so it's like, they're not that needy, right? Whereas in our society, you ask somebody, what do you need? It's like, oh, I need to find my soulmate and I need to like resolve my childhood trauma and I need to find a fulfilling career. And it's like all these needs, right? And so I don't think that the problem is that we are no longer experiencing need, is that we are no longer needed. We don't feel needed, right? We don't feel like something or someone needs us anymore. And I think that that to me is really like the driving lack, as it were. And I think that like the whole anti-natal thing, it's like these people, they can't get past the frame of like, I need and fulfillment of my need, right? It's like, why do I need a child? And then it's like, we were talking about how people will say, well, you shouldn't have a child because then you're going to like impose your trauma onto them and they're going to have a messed up life. And I feel like in the ancient world, it would have been like, okay, so you're going to raise a child who's psychologically kind of messed up, but when the enemy comes to attack us, that child will be able to hold a sword and defend the city, right? So have the child, right? Because the enemies are going to come attack us, and like that child will be needed. It's not that that child will have needs that you can then fulfill and that'll be good. So that child will be needed, and that child can then someday fulfill that need and be and have purpose, right? And that's really what life was about, and I think still is. And I think that losing track of that is really the crisis in our society. And so I think the question is not like, what do we need? The question is, how are we needed? And I do think that religion gives us that. And religion, like Cadell was saying, it like merges these drives, right? Where it's like that, because once you lose track of the way in which you're needed, then all you have left is either hedonism on the one side, right? It's just like, what do I want and how can I get it? Or you have this sort of reversion. Like I think the anti-natalists, they replace sort of the transcendent good with this regression back to this like natural state, right? They say that like humans have thrown things out of balance, and so the good is just this kind of like return to the womb, right? This sort of like return to an equilibrated natural state, right? And you know, thinking about this in terms of children, it's like the good that you can do for your children is just to give them this perfect life where they never have any trauma and everything's just like they just float in this vat of booty transcendence. And so yeah, I think I don't know, I've lost my train of thought now, but I think we need to return to a conception of how we are needed, and I think that that'll solve a lot of our problems. I'll just leave it there.
That was wonderful, Javier. I'll give it to Javier and bring us to the close. This has been wonderful. I think this is no, I think you didn't forget your point, because arriving at booty transcendence sounds like the ultimate point, actually. I really like what you said about the idea that if we need necessity, we haven't gone beyond necessity, right? And it seems like there's plenty of needs, and I really like that point that there's a multiplication of needs through history. That's really interesting, because we become more needy on the psychological, seemingly as we get more choice, because then we have to own those choices or make those choices, which brings psychological baggage. I think it was an excellent point. So let me give it to Javier Rivera. Mr. Rivera, tell us about booty transcendence.
So, to Fishman's point, Fishman, I don't think you, so I don't actually disagree with you. I think we're actually talking about the same thing. It's just you like kind of interpret it differently. But yes, like the way I understand necessity is subsistence. But what's ironic about this, and I've been taking some sociology classes and so on, is that when you start looking at these anthropological cultures in the beginning, they had an economics of subsistence. It was about doing enough to sustain the village and the group, the hunter-gatherer group, right? Everybody had to do enough to subsist. You can never reach out of an excess because it wasn't guaranteed. The excess was never guaranteed. The problem with technology now is that it gives us this illusion that the excess is actually guaranteed. That you can have the excess. And so now what we've gone from is we've gone from a culture, from the beginning of evolution, from a culture that was kind of having an economic subsistence to an economics of exchange. This is the whole anti-natalist argument. Why? It doesn't exchange right in my mind. It makes no sense. The moment we start talking about exchange, the black hole opens up, in my opinion, because well, actually, I would say you're covering up the black hole by talking about this economics of exchange. And it's this idea of subsistence. And yes, I think we have to talk about education now, to some degree, because I feel like parents, what they have this fear of is that now it's my responsibility to educate and morally train the child. But education now is just a machine. Like I'm dead ass. It's literally just a machine. Like it's for you to become productive as a machine, just another cogwheel in the machine, right? They say, what major do you want? That's your cogwheel, right? Like that's the cogwheel you want to participate in the machine. So, and I feel like education is super linked to talking about, anti-natalism and thinking about this question of birth and everything, because I think education should be a system of purification. What do I mean by a system of purification? It means that we should allow children and people that are curious to subsist in what they want to discover and think that they enjoy, right? I think the beauty of education that's been stripped away is that no longer we can explore the uncertainty within our own educational kind of like doubts and explorations. Everything has to be set in stone now. You from the beginning, you're asked when you're a child, what do you want to be when you grow up? From the beginning, it's automatically a kind of exchangist question, right? You're going to choose something, and if you don't choose right, well, one, you may not have enough money to pay for college. You want to make sure that you can have, be able to pay the debt back. So you can't just be switching majors and exploring. So what we have now is the ultimate end of education with an anti-natalist argument, because why bother exploring? It seems, in fact, more scarier to explore the uncertainties of the navigational pool that we could have in education as a sort of purification process. But instead, it's directly for utility and machine. And this is why schools are panicking over the machine, because they are the machine. They're being replaced by another machine. And what's funny about the ethics in school is that it's not fucking ethics at all. It's a way to cover the machine gap within the educational institution, and yet they call that ethics. They call that you're being an ethical academic by not cheating, by not plagiarizing. No. In fact, the reason why cheating works is because it's a machine. ChatGPT, baby. The reason why cheating works is because it's a machine. And that's what's so disturbing for people, and they try to cover it up because we don't actually have any real education that has any real epistemological value in it. Because a machine could do it. And if a machine can do it, you can get away with cheating. But in my opinion, cheating is supposed to be a sort of self-corrective process, right? Like I shouldn't be able to cheat and get away with it. It should be like, oh, I cheated, and now I'm kind of facing my own, like, downfall, essentially. But the fact that you can go through college and essentially cheat your whole way through already shows that there's a gap in the machine. And so this is why I think education has to be focused on kind of the ethical structure of a real ethics of purification, of wondering and exploring uncertainty. This is never, uncertainty is almost like damned in education. And the only time that you can ever reach any epistemological uncertainty is a kind of privilege gap. Meaning if you can afford a PhD, if you can get there, if you're willing to sort of waste your money to get there, then you discover everything's kind of groundless and kind of shady. But most people are not going to get there. So they're going to fall on what they have, right? The sort of exchangeist certainty of, look, if I just get a major in this, I will get this outcome of living. That's the safest way to live. And obviously, if I have children, that increases my expenses, and I'm not going to wait. I'm not going to wager that. I'm not going to do that. So I think education is a very crucial mediator in this process as well.
Excellent, Javier. I think Bruce Alderman has indeed done wonderful work on that, as mentioned in the chat. I think that's exactly right. And I really like this idea that you can only cheat the machine. If you can cheat, it's evidence that it's a machine. You certainly cannot cheat the real. And really, then the question is, how do we do education in a manner that takes seriously the real and takes seriously educating in realms we cannot cheat in, because those are the realms of the real. And those would seem to be what we have to take seriously. So Ivan Illich, to bring it, to a few closing thoughts, Ivan Illich, he wrote on education, he wrote on medical nemesis, he wrote on a number of things, and he had a spot on his neck that looked very cancerous. And a lot of his friends said, you need to get that checked, you need to get that taken care of, but he refused. He said no, and he never did. And a lot of people were like, you're a maniac, you're insane, why wouldn't you do it? But he, for some reason, had an impulse that this was the suffering he needed to live with, because if he didn't live with it, something would be lost that could not be put into words until it was gained. And it was only gained at the end of one's life. So he never dealt with it. And everyone thought he was crazy, but he also strongly believed that he needed it in order to master the art of suffering. And he argued that you could not be human unless you mastered the art of suffering. But he noted, and all of his books can be seen this way, that it was very difficult to gain dignity from the art of suffering where institutions were everywhere. So there was the medical apparatus. You can just go to the doctor. Why don't you get medicine? Why don't you go to the doctor? You suddenly become irrational to defend the space of your suffering that Ivan Illich believed was extremely necessary to be fully human. And so it's much harder to defend that space. He then moves to education. He says, likewise, it is very difficult to experiment and to learn things you're not getting a job for, because why would you read that book if you're not getting a job? Why would you experiment and be wrong and take all these risks? And so he warns that the institution of the school made it possible to do the forms of education that he believed were necessary for full humanity, because real education comes from the mistake. It comes from the experimentation. It comes from the trials and tribulations of not knowing what is the case and groping around through many old books to find insight that you don't know for sure is there or not, but you believe it might be, and thus you try. And so Ivan Illich is going through all of these examples of where institutions have made it incredibly difficult to actually be human, because the things that make us human are the things that the institutions by definition correct. You do not go to school to experiment. You go to learn the right answers and to memorize them. So you can't find the right answer themselves. Well, Ivan Illich says the full human comes from the effort of finding the answers more so than the finding of the answers, because the very act of trying to find the answers and not even knowing if that will pay off requires a certain courage and conditioning of character that if the human does not have, they cannot fully live. Likewise, the dignity of suffering seems to be something that the human needs to be fully alive. And all of this speaks to what Ivan Illich would then connect, I think, with Joseph Piper's book on leisure, the basis of culture, where Mr. Illich would say, if human beings are not fully human in these ways, it will be impossible for them to have leisure. And leisure is the basis for culture. Ivan would agree with that. And what Joseph Piper will say is today, we're not able to have leisure. I know that Peter Lindbergh will talk about this book over at the Stoa. And leisure is different than free time. Leisure is that contemplative state of inaction that is precisely the highest action of the realization of what is fully human. And Mr. Piper warns that today people tend to define leisure in terms of really a state of doing nothing, which for him, idleness is the opposite of leisure. And that then leads to people being utilitarian, because that's the only ethical system they have, and thus they go back to work and they're productive according to corporations, and thus we lose leisure. And in losing leisure, we also lose the human. So Ivan Illich's thinking is also tied to leisure, because if you can't gain these human elements of suffering, if you can't gain these human elements of experimentation, then you cannot have leisure, which is the basis of culture and humanity. So we don't have these things, and the institutional forces makes it irrational or unthinkable to do these things. And then from a place of not being fully human, we are asked, do you want to have kids? How do you make that choice if you're not fully human? What does it even mean to make a choice of should you have kids? What does the institution tell you? No, or when you're ready, or if they're going to be workers, or global warming. The institution doesn't give you the resources to think those things, because precisely in their very utilitarian structure, that lends itself in the direction of being unable to have the metaphysical values to make said choices, because it is all about avoiding the suffering that comes with having children. It's all about not thinking for yourself that would be needed to do the live improvisation of having children and to see value of those things. So there's an improvisation of the resources needed for the choice to have children, but the institutions then through the medical apparatus gives you birth control and says, do it if you want. And yet you don't even have the necessities, the values to even know how to make those choices. So we find ourselves in a very strange place. It would seem as if to regain the ability to even make that choice, one would have to also regain the conditions of leisure in which one can find the fully human, to even know the basis of that choice. So then children aren't having children. People in trauma are not having traumas, right? Just like Cadell has talked about it many times. And I do wonder, as a note coming to the close here, if birth control has not in its very existence created a psychological sort of chaos that then makes people more likely to be traumatized and thus think they should use the birth control. Because with the birth control comes more choices of how you live your lives, more options of what you could be. Why did you make X choices versus not? And so it could be the case that birth control has actually in its very existence increased the likelihood of thinking you need to use it, because the very horizon it opens up is traumatizing to people who have not done the work of leisure to be the Nietzschean children to handle that kind of choice. So it may be a kind of auto-cannibalistic technology that in order to correct, one would need to spread the conditions of absolute knowing, children, etc., so forth of Nietzsche. Now, all of that said, I think the final choice for the so those all seem to be part of the conversation of what needs to be done for pronatalism. And I think the final point I would say is that a lot of anti-natalists may say that it's immoral to choose to bring people into this world who do not choose to be brought into this world, right? I didn't choose to be born. It's by definition immoral to force people to be born who do not choose to be born. I've heard that line of argument, and it's quite appealing. Funny enough, it does require a neoliberal horizon of the human where choice is the ultimate good in order for that logic to follow, and many anti-natalists tend to be critical of the corporate structure, and that's kind of the same ethical paradigm of a lot of neoliberalism. But there's some validity to this point. Is it not immoral to choose to bring people into the world if they themselves did not choose to be brought into this world? Well, I think this brings a line from Mr. Philip Reef that I know Raymond K. Hessel has brought up quite a number of times. And Philip Reef said that the human does not seek to choose, the human seeks to be chosen. That's where we find the fullness. And you see, perhaps one of the negation sublations of birth control that was not possible until its existence that would be possible is that every single child could be chosen, as opposed to just something that emerged without choice randomly as a result of people wanting to have sex, but maybe not wanting to have kids. Children today can be chosen, which is precisely why they can be more psychologically and traumatically difficult to have. But in that act of making them chosen, perhaps if we were to raise children in a condition where they felt that chosenness, it would actually give rise to spiritual realities or spiritual fittedness that wasn't possible before. But it would be the responsibility of parents then to make their children feel so chosen, not in a way that makes them little emperors and say China or egotistical or so on and so forth. But instead, they are chosen to be part of that very space of leisure that the parent themselves has come in, that space where suffering and experimentation can give rise to the fullness of the human being. And you have chosen to let them come into that space with you. And you have chosen it because it is good, beautiful, and true. And you are able to show them that because you do it yourself. And so I do think that we are in an age where it's possible to help children overcome this problem of not feeling chosen precisely because their very birth requires them to be chosen. But then it would require us to show that that chosenness is meaningful by the way we live our own lives. So I think that could perhaps be part of the work today. But this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate everyone's thoughts. Thank you for staying. It is a pleasure. You all have a wonderful day. Thank you so much. All the best.